I found the photo album on a Sunday morning. It was on the dining room table, closed neatly, the kind of worn, leather-bound book you'd expect to find in an antique shop or a forgotten attic. The problem was, I didn't own a photo album like that, and I lived alone. My first thought was that my sister had left it there. She had a spare key and a habit of dropping by unannounced. But when I called her, she sounded groggy and annoyed. "No, I didn't leave anything. Are you okay?" "Yeah," I said, staring at the album. "I guess I just forgot where it came from." "Sure," she muttered, already losing interest. "Get some sleep, Oliver. You sound weird." I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the table and stared at the album for what felt like an hour. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance. The leather was cracked at the edges, the pages slightly yellowed, and the corners bumped as if it had been passed around for years. No title, no markings, no clue as to its origin. I opened it. The first photo was of me. I was standing in my old backyard, the one from the house I grew up in. I couldn't have been more than 10, my hair messy, my favorite Spider-Man shirt slightly too small for me. I was grinning at the camera, holding up a frog I'd caught in the creek that ran behind our house. But I didn't remember that picture being taken. The weird part wasn't just the photo, it was the perspective. It wasn't taken from my parents' usual vantage point, standing on the porch or at the edge of the yard. This was taken from inside the woods. You could see the faint outline of the trees in the foreground, the camera angled slightly through the brush. I turned the page. The second photo was also of me. This time I was a teenager, about 16, sitting on the hood of my first car, an ancient blue Honda Civic. The picture was grainy, slightly overexposed, but unmistakably taken in front of my high school. I was laughing, one hand holding a can of soda, the other shielding my eyes from the sun. But again, the angle was off. It was taken from a distance, through the chain-link fence that surrounded the parking lot. I could make out the shadows of the fence crisscrossing the bottom of the image. I turned the pages faster now. Photo after photo. All of me, walking to class in college, laughing with friends at a bar I barely remembered going to, sitting in the park where I'd had my first real date. The photos were all candid, taken from strange angles, behind bushes, through windows from across streets. The farther I went, the more recent the photos became. There was one of me leaving my office just last week, my tie loose, phone in hand. Another of me grocery shopping 2 nights ago, reaching for a carton of milk. The last photo made my blood run cold. It was of me sitting at the dining room table. This table. Right now. The photo captured me perfectly. My hand resting on the album, my head tilted slightly to the side, my face frozen in the same expression I wore at that exact moment. I shot out of the chair, the album tumbling to the floor. My heart pounded as I stared at the open page, at the frozen version of myself staring back. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The caller ID said, "Unknown number." I answered on instinct, my voice shaking. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric. Then a voice. "Keep looking." I hung up and backed away from the phone as if it might explode. My mind raced. I didn't know what to do, who to call. The police? What would I even say? Someone's been following me and left me a creepy photo album? I wasn't sure I'd believe me if I heard it, but I couldn't just leave it there. I picked up the album, my hands trembling, and turned the page. The next photo was of my living room. It was taken from the hallway, slightly blurry, as if the photographer had been moving when they snapped it. The light was on, the couch cushions slightly askew, exactly as I'd left it that morning. The photo after that was of my bedroom. The bed was unmade, the blinds half closed, a pair of shoes kicked off in the corner. The angle made my stomach churn. It was taken from inside the closet. I slammed the album shut and threw it across the room. Something clattered behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The blinds in the living room window swayed slightly, as if they'd just been disturbed. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. That's when I saw the smudge. A handprint. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely there, pressed into the glass from the inside. I backed away slowly, grabbing my phone again. My hand shook as I dialed 911, my voice barely above a whisper when the operator answered. "Someone's in my house. I managed to choke out. The operator asked for my address, and I gave it to her, glancing nervously around the room. And then, as I turned back toward the window, I froze. The photo album was on the table again. I hadn't put it there. It was open to a new page. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The photo showed me standing in the middle of the living room, holding my phone, terror etched across my face. Behind me, in the shadows near the hallway, a figure loomed. Tall, gaunt, its face obscured, its hands stretched out toward me. I turned, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the album, the page was blank. The operator's voice crackled through the phone, distant now, almost drowned out by static. Sir? Sir, are you there? I don't know, I whispered. The static grew louder, filling the room until it wasn't just in the phone. It was everywhere. The lights flickered, the walls seemed to close in, and then, just as abruptly as it started, everything stopped. I was alone. The album was gone. The handprint on the window was gone. Even the phone in my hand was blank, its battery dead. But I know it wasn't a dream. This morning, there was a new photo on my phone. It's me, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. And I wasn't the one who took it. Let's start a new story. It began on an ordinary Thursday. I was at my desk, staring at the endless stream of emails demanding my attention, when the notification popped up. Not on my computer, though, on my phone. A text from an unknown number. Have you seen the door yet? I frowned, setting my coffee aside to type a quick response. Wrong number. Immediately, another reply came through. It's not the wrong number. A cold shiver crept up my spine, but I tried to shake it off. Probably a prank. I muted the conversation and went back to work, but I couldn't stop glancing at my phone, half expecting another message to appear. None did. That evening, I walked home like always, my earbuds in, music drowning out the noise of the city. The routine soothed me. The same streets, the same corner store where I'd grab a snack, the same graffitied wall I passed every day. But that night, the wall was different. The familiar spray-painted slogans were gone, replaced by a single image, a tall black door, its surface gleaming as though freshly painted. Beneath it, in hurried white script, were the words, "Have you seen it yet?" My steps faltered. The door on the wall looked wrong, too real, as though it wasn't painted at all but somehow embedded into the brick. I reached out, half expecting to feel cold metal beneath my fingers, but the surface was smooth and dry. Just paint. I pulled my hand back quickly, a sense of unease prickling at the back of my neck. I walked faster, not stopping until I was safely inside my apartment. That night, I dreamed of the door. It was freestanding in a vast expanse of darkness, its black surface reflecting faint, rippling light, as though it were hovering over water. The air was cold and thick, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear faint whispers. I moved toward it, compelled by a pull I couldn't explain. The whispers grew louder as I reached for the handle. The moment I touched it, the whispers stopped, and then I woke up. The next day, the text messages resumed. "You're getting closer." I didn't reply this time. I deleted the entire thread, but the messages kept coming, no matter what I did. It wants you to see it. Don't ignore it. You're almost ready. By the third day, my world began to unravel. On my walk to work, I passed a bus stop where an old man sat, staring straight ahead. His expression was vacant, but as I moved past him, his head snapped toward me, his eyes locking on mine. "Don't open it," he said, his voice cracked and low. I stopped in my tracks, the words catching me off guard. "Excuse me?" The man didn't respond. He was back to staring into space, as though I'd imagined the whole thing. At the office, my coworkers were different. Too polite, too calm, their smiles lingering a beat too long. When I glanced at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, it wasn't quite right. My eyes seemed darker, my face thinner. That evening, I took a different route home, avoiding the graffitied wall. But it didn't matter. The door found me. It stood at the end of an alley I'd never noticed before, a narrow passage between two buildings I passed every day. There was no graffiti this time, no white script urging me forward. Just the door, tall and black, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. I told myself to keep walking, to turn away and never look back. But my feet moved toward it on their own, the air around me growing heavier with each step. When I reached the door, I saw my reflection in its polished surface. It wasn't my face staring back. The version of me in the reflection was smiling, its eyes gleaming with a strange, hungry light. "You've been chosen," it said, though its lips didn't move. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The air buzzed with static, and for a moment, the world around me seemed to ripple. And then I heard it, the hum, low and steady like a heartbeat coming from the other side of the door. I ran. For days, the door was all I could think about. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it waiting for me, its dark surface shimmering. The text kept coming, more insistent now. "Why are you running? You can't escape it. It's yours." By the end of the week, I gave in. The door was back in the alley, waiting. This time, the hum was louder, vibrating through my chest as I approached. My reflection grinned at me, its eyes wide and unblinking. I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers touched the metal, the world dissolved. I was no longer in the alley. The space around me was infinite, a void of swirling shadows and faint light. The door stood behind me, closed now, its surface pulsing faintly like a living thing. In the distance, I saw a figure. It was human-shaped but wrong, its edges blurred and shifting, like smoke trapped in a glass jar. As it moved closer, I realized it wasn't a stranger. It was me, but not just one version of me, thousands. Each figure flickered with subtle differences. A scar across the cheek, a missing eye, hair longer or shorter. They surrounded me, their faces calm, almost pitying. One stepped forward, the features familiar but warped, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. "You opened it," it said, its voice layered with 1,000 echoes. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head. "The in-between. The space behind the seams. You've always felt it, haven't you? The edges of things unraveling." I didn't answer. The figure smiled, a wide, unsettling grin. "Now you're part of it." The other versions of me closed in, their eyes gleaming. The door behind me began to hum louder, the sound swallowing everything. And then there was nothing. I woke up in my apartment, gasping for air. The texts were gone, and the door was nowhere to be found. But the world isn't the same. The hum is still there, faint and constant, vibrating beneath the surface of everything. My reflection doesn't always move when I do. And sometimes, when I pass a darkened window, I see the door waiting in the distance. One day, I know it will open again, and this time, I won't wake up. Let's start a new story. I was sitting in my apartment late one night, scrolling through mindless social media posts, when it hit me, faint, acrid metallic. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before, and yet it was disturbingly familiar. I thought at first it was coming from the air vents, an electrical issue, maybe, but when I moved closer, it wasn't stronger near the vents. It was everywhere, hanging in the air, clinging to the walls. I opened all the windows, hoping to air the place out, but the smell didn't dissipate. If anything, it got stronger. By the time I went to bed, it had sunk into my skin, the back of my throat burning with every breath. The next morning, it was gone. I didn't think about it again until 3 nights later, when I found the stain. It was on the floor in the corner of my living room, just under the window. At first, I thought it was water damage, a dark, irregular patch that seemed to shimmer faintly under the light. But when I crouched down to inspect it, the smell hit me again. That same sharp, metallic tang, stronger now, almost overwhelming. I reached out to touch the stain, but my fingers stopped just above it. The air was cold there, unnaturally so, and the longer I hovered my hand over the patch, the more wrong it felt. I backed away, telling myself I'd deal with it in the morning. That night, I dreamed of voices. They were soft at first, distant murmurs that I couldn't quite make out. But as the dream progressed, the voices grew louder, clearer. "Help us." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen. I turned on every light in the apartment, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner. The stain had grown. What had been a small patch the size of a dinner plate was now twice as large, its edges darker, more defined. The surface shimmered faintly, like oil on water, and the air around it was frigid. I called my landlord the next morning, describing the stain as calmly as I could. He promised to send someone to look at it, but days passed and no one came. The stain kept growing. By the end of the week, it had spread halfway across the living room floor. The smell was unbearable now, thick and choking, filling every corner of the apartment. No amount of cleaning helped. The voices returned, no longer confined to dreams. Please, we're still here. Don't leave us. I started hearing them during the day, faint whispers that seemed to come from the edges of the room. Whenever I turned to look, the stain seemed to shift slightly, as though the light were playing tricks on it. I stopped sleeping. One night, as I sat on the couch staring at the stain, I noticed movement. It was subtle at first, just a faint ripple across the surface. Then the edges began to bubble, dark tendrils curling upward like smoke. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the tendrils solidified, reaching out toward the walls. And then I saw them. Hands. They were small, emaciated, their fingers clawing at the air, their nails blackened and broken. More hands followed, pressing against the surface of the stain, their skin pale and translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. The voices grew louder. Help us! I backed away, my feet tangling in the rug, sending me crashing to the floor. The hands pressed harder against the surface of the stain, the material rippling like fabric stretched too thin. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the outline of a face began to emerge. It was faint, indistinct, as though seen through frosted glass. But the eyes, they were unmistakable, sunken, hollow, and staring directly at me. The voice that followed wasn't a whisper anymore. Why did you leave us? I screamed and ran, slamming the door behind me. I spent the night in my car, parked 2 blocks away, the engine idling to keep the heat on. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hands, the face, the eyes. When I finally worked up the courage to return the next morning, the stain was gone. The air in the apartment was stale, the faint metallic smell lingering like a bad memory. The living room floor was spotless, as though nothing had ever been there. But the whispers didn't stop. Even now, weeks later, I hear them, faint and distant, just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes they're coming from the corners of my bedroom, sometimes from the walls, and sometimes, late at night, they're coming from under the floor. Let's start a new story. It was late, close to midnight, and I was half asleep on the couch with some mindless crime drama mumbling on the TV. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, its screen lighting up the darkened room. I glanced at it, expecting a scam call or a drunk text from a friend, but the name on the screen stopped me cold. Unknown caller. I never answer those. Ever. But something made me pick up this time. Maybe the quiet, insistent buzzing or the strange heaviness that had been hanging in the air all day. Whatever the reason, I swiped to accept and pressed the phone to my ear. Hello. Silence. Hello. I said again, my voice sharper this time. I was about to hang up when a voice finally came through. Soft, flat, like someone speaking through a thick pane of glass. Is this Owen? My stomach dropped. It was my name, but the way they said it like they were trying it out for the first time, tasting it, sent a chill down my spine. Who is this? I demanded. There was a pause, long enough to make me think the call had disconnected. Then the voice came again, quieter now. I need you to listen. Before I could respond, a sound crackled through the line, a distant, rhythmic hum, almost like static, but layered with something deeper. It reminded me of ocean waves, the way they crash and pull back, endless and hypnotic. My head buzzed, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. My living room felt smaller, darker, as if the walls were closing in. I don't know who you are, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I'm hanging up. No, the voice said, sharper now. Don't hang up. They're coming. And then the line went dead. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to laugh it off. A prank call, I told myself. Some bored teenager messing around. But the voice stuck with me, the calmness of it, the way it seemed to crawl under my skin. I locked my door and checked the windows just in case. Then I went to bed, telling myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. A soft, metallic scraping, like nails dragging across a steel surface. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more deliberate, until it seemed to be coming from just outside my bedroom door. I froze. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom on the second floor, and there was no way anyone could have gotten in without me hearing. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but when I turned it on, the screen flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. The scraping stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. The air felt thick, pressing against me like a living thing. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud. 3 soft taps, deliberate and patient. I stared at the door, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stay still, to stay quiet. The knocking came again, harder this time, and then a voice. Owen. It wasn't like the voice from the phone. This one was deeper, rawer, as if something was trying to force words out of a throat that wasn't built for them. I know you're there. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A dream? A hallucination? But the voice came again, impossibly close. Open the door. I don't know what made me do it. Fear? Curiosity? Some strange compulsion I couldn't resist? My hand moved to the doorknob before I could stop myself, and as soon as I touched it, the air in the room shifted. The knocking stopped. The silence was deafening, like the world itself had been muted. My fingers tightened around the knob, and I slowly turned it, pulling the door open just a crack. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, the dim light from the kitchen casting long shadows across the floor. But something felt wrong. The air smelled faintly of metal, sharp and tangy, and the shadows didn't look quite right. They were too long, too fluid, like they were moving on their own. I stepped back, closing the door, and locked it. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear against the wood, listening for any sign of movement. And then I heard it, breathing, slow, deliberate, and just on the other side of the door. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen and clutching the knob. Minutes? Hours? But when I finally worked up the courage to look again, the breathing was gone. The hallway was silent. The next morning, I found scratches on the outside of my door. Deep, jag marks that carve into the wood like claws. My phone was on the nightstand, its screen cracked and unresponsive, though I didn't remember dropping it. And when I went to check my front door, I found a single word written in black, greasy letters across the wall. Listen, I don't know what they wanted. I don't know why they chose me. But every night since, I've heard the scraping, the knocking, the voice calling my name. I haven't answered. Not yet. Let's start a new story. At the grocery store. It was a simple, cream-colored envelope with no return address. My name, just my first name, was written on the front in an elegant looping script. I figured it was some kind of weird marketing ploy, or maybe a mix-up, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it right there in the parking lot. Inside was a single sheet of thick, textured paper, blank except for 2 words written in the same neat handwriting. Don't look. I frowned, flipping the paper over to see if there was more, but that was it. No logo, no explanation, no fin. Just those 2 words. I scanned the lot, half expecting to see someone watching me, but it was empty save for a few shoppers loading their cars. I tossed the letter into the passenger seat and tried to forget about it. The second letter came 3 days later. This time, it was waiting for me on my kitchen counter when I got home from work. My apartment was locked, and I lived alone. I stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, staring at the envelope. It was identical to the first one, same cream paper, same elegant handwriting, but my name wasn't on this one. Instead, the front read, "Stop looking." I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't help myself. My hands trembled as I slid out the note inside. This time, it wasn't blank. It had a list. 1. Don't look behind you. 2. Don't look into the dark. 3. Don't look for too long. I dropped the letter, my chest tight. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I fought the urge to turn around. The apartment was silent except for the low hum of the fridge, but the air felt heavier now, like someone was standing just out of sight. I turned on every light in the place, checked the locks twice, and spent the night on the couch with the TV blaring. The third letter arrived a week later. It was slid under my door in the middle of the night. This one was different. The envelope was damp, the edges curling, and the handwriting was shakier, less composed. My name was scrawled across the front, jagged and uneven, as though whoever had written it was in a hurry. Inside was a single sentence, written in thick, almost desperate strokes. "It's already seen you." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I noticed the mirror. It was in the hallway, an old, full-length mirror I'd never seen before, its ornate gold frame tarnished with age. I didn't own a mirror like that, and I had no idea how it had gotten there. My reflection looked wrong. Not at first glance. It moved when I moved, tilted its head when I tilted mine, but there was something off about it. The longer I stared, the more I felt like it was watching me, not copying me. I covered it with a sheet and shoved it into the back of my closet. That night, I had the dream. I was standing in a vast, empty room, its walls stretching endlessly into the darkness. The air was thick, almost liquid, and I could hear something breathing, slow, wet, and ragged. Then I saw it, a figure at the far end of the room, hunched and impossibly tall, its limbs contorted into unnatural angles. It didn't move at first, just stood there, its face obscured by shadow. But as I stared, it started to turn, its head twisting slowly, as if it was trying to meet my gaze. I woke up gasping, my heart hammering in my chest. The fourth letter was waiting for me on the nightstand. "Don't let it in." The words were smeared, as though the ink had been dragged by trembling fingers. I threw the letter away, but the warnings didn't stop. Every night, I found new notes on my bathroom mirror, taped to the inside of my front door, tucked into my coat pocket. "Don't look for too long. It knows where you sleep. Close the curtains." The mirror kept reappearing. No matter how many times I tried to get rid of it, leaving it at the curb, dumping it in an alley, it always came back. I'd find it in the hallway, the closet, even propped against the wall at the foot of my bed. The last note came 2 nights ago. It was sitting on the kitchen table when I came home, surrounded by broken glass. My first thought was that someone had smashed the mirror, but when I looked, it was still intact, standing in the hallway, its surface gleaming like polished water. The note said, "It's here." I didn't sleep. I stayed in the living room, clutching a flashlight, waiting for something. At some point in the early hours, I heard it, a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the closet door. I knew what it wanted. I don't know how I'm still writing this. The mirror is in front of me now. I didn't move it. I don't know how it got here. My reflection is smiling, but I'm not. Let's start a new story. The first time I heard the voice, I was in the elevator at work. It was a Friday night, long after everyone else had left. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I'd been pulling another late shift, crunching numbers that didn't want to add up. By the time I packed my things and headed for the elevator, my eyes burned, and my head felt stuffed with cotton. The ride down started normally enough, floor 12, floor 11, floor 10. But then, as the elevator passed the 9th floor, it stopped. Not with the smooth precision it usually had, but with a jolt that made my stomach lurch. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then stayed on. "Great," I muttered, stabbing the button for the lobby. Nothing happened. I pressed the emergency button, but the speaker only crackled faintly, like it was trying to wake up. I stepped back, running a hand through my hair, trying to think. It wasn't the first time the ancient elevator had thrown a fit, and maintenance had never been particularly quick to respond. Then I heard it, a faint, melodic whisper coming from behind me. At first, I thought it was the elevator speaker, maybe static or interference from another line. But when I turned around, the sound grew louder. It was coming from the seam of the elevator doors. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing in the tiny metal box. The whisper stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was my own breathing. Then, just as I reached for the emergency button again, the voice spoke. "You're late. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, smooth, and just slightly off, like someone mimicking a human voice and almost getting it right. I stumbled back, my spine pressing against the cold steel wall. "Who's there?" I demanded, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The voice didn't reply. Instead, the elevator jolted again, lurching upward this time. The floor display blinked erratically. 12, 14, 16. "There is no 16th floor," I whispered to myself, clutching the handrail. The elevator stopped with a shudder, and the doors slid open. Beyond them was not the lobby, nor any floor I recognized. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, its walls lined with door after identical door. The air smelled faintly of old wood and something metallic, and the light was dim, casting long shadows that danced as if alive. I leaned out, craning my neck to see farther down the corridor. The hallway was completely silent, yet I felt a faint vibration in the air, like the hum of something massive turning just out of sight. "Step out," the voice said again, softer now, almost coaxing. "No," I said, gripping the handrail tighter. The elevator doors began to close, but before they shut completely, one of the doors in the hallway opened. A figure stepped out. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinct against the dim light. But as it moved closer, I saw it more clearly. It looked like me. Same height, same build, same clothes. But its face was wrong. The features were blurred, like a half-forgotten memory, and the eyes were nothing but empty sockets. It raised a hand, beckoning. "Come," the voice said, and this time it came from the figure. I slammed the elevator button repeatedly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The doors hesitated for a moment, then finally slid shut. The elevator groaned and began to move, its descent uneven and jerky. The floor numbers blinked erratically, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't stop again. When the doors finally opened to the lobby, I practically fell out of the elevator. The security guard, Jim, looked up from his desk, startled. "You okay?" he asked, his brows furrowing. "There's something wrong with the elevator," I managed to say, my voice shaking. He gave me a puzzled look. "You mean the one you just stepped out of?" I turned to point at it, but the doors were already shut, and the elevator began its smooth ascent as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I considered calling the building manager, but what would I even say? That I'd seen something? That the elevator had taken me to a place that didn't exist? By Monday, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination, stress, sleep deprivation, maybe even a lucid dream. Until the voice came back. This time, it was in my car. I was driving home, stuck at a red light, when I heard it, soft, melodic, and undeniably familiar. "You didn't come." I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure sitting in the back seat. But there was nothing there. The light turned green, and I sped through the intersection, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. That night, the dream started. In them, I was back in the elevator, descending past floors that shouldn't exist. The voice called to me, always just out of sight, leading me to the endless hallway and the blurred figure that waited there. "Why do you run?" it would ask. By the end of the week, I was avoiding the elevator entirely, taking the stairs no matter how many flights it meant. But it didn't matter. The voice followed me, at work, at home, even in my reflection. One night, I woke to find my bedroom door ajar. Standing in the hallway was the figure, its face clearer now, but still wrong, still too close to mine. It tilted its head, and for the first time, it smiled. "You can't stay away forever," it said, its voice like the creak of old wood. I don't know what it wants, and I'm terrified to find out. But last night, I woke up in the elevator again, and this time, the door was already open. Let's start a new story. The first time I noticed something was off, it was the sound of her keys. Maya always had this distinctive jingle when she walked in, a chaotic little tune from the keychains she collected over the years. But one Thursday evening, as the front door opened, the jingle was different. Quieter, muted. She walked in carrying her laptop bag, her smile a little too tight. "Late meeting," she said, tossing the bag onto the couch. You wouldn't believe the drama at work. I believed her, or at least I told myself I did. But something about the way she said it, The way her words landed too neatly like a rehearsed line made me pause. Maya was never one for theatrics. She had this blunt, matter-of-fact way of saying things. But lately, everything she said felt curated. That weekend, I found the sweatshirt. It was draped over the back of her desk chair in our shared office, navy blue with a college logo I didn't recognize. Maya wasn't sentimental about clothes. She didn't keep old hoodies from her school days or borrow ones from friends. And this sweatshirt was too big for her, the sleeves baggy and stretched. Where'd this come from? I asked her later that evening, holding it up. She barely glanced at it. "Oh, it's Allison's," she said, naming her closest friend. "She lent it to me when we were out last week. I got cold." Again, I nodded. The explanation was simple, clean, but my chest tightened, the faintest edge of unease creeping in. The next time it was her laughter. Maya had always been one of those people who laughed freely, without worrying if it was too loud or if it made people stare. But that day, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, she let out a quiet chuckle, soft, private, like it wasn't meant for me to hear. "What's so funny?" I asked, leaning over to catch a glimpse of her screen. She angled it away quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Just a meme," she said, locking the phone and standing up. "I'm going to grab some tea." "Want anything?" I shook my head, my stomach nodding. She'd never hidden her phone before. One night, when she said she was meeting friends for dinner, I decided to test my growing suspicions. After she left, I called Allison. We weren't particularly close, but we'd always been friendly. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone light. "Maya said you guys were grabbing dinner. Did she leave yet?" There was a pause, just long enough to be damning. "Oh no," Allison said slowly. "I haven't seen her in a couple weeks. Is everything okay?" I ended the call with some excuse about getting wires crossed, but my chest felt like it had been hollowed out. She'd lied. Not just a small lie, not just forgetting to tell me about a change of plans. This was deliberate. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I waited, watching for more cracks to show. And they did. Late nights at work turned into overnight conferences she'd never mentioned before. Her playlist shifted. Songs I'd never heard her hum before became staples, always playing when she was alone. Then there was the hotel key. I found it one Saturday morning while vacuuming the living room. It had fallen between the couch cushions, the thin plastic card with the name of a hotel downtown. When she came into the room, I held it up without a word. Her face went pale. "That's not mine," she said quickly, too quickly. "It must have been there when we bought the couch." "Maya," I said, my voice steady, "we've had this couch for 3 years." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, she didn't have an answer. That night, I followed her. She said she was meeting her book club, a group she'd joined a year ago, but rarely talked about. Her car led me downtown, past the cafe where the club usually met, to a quiet side street. She parked outside a wine bar, the kind with low lighting and jazz music spilling softly through the windows. I waited. 10 minutes later, a man walked in, tall, well-dressed, with a confident stride. Maya followed shortly after, her hand brushing his arm as they stepped inside together. I stayed in the car, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't need to see more. I didn't want to. When she came home that night, I was sitting at the dining table, the hotel key in front of me. She froze when she saw it, her smile faltering. "I know," I said quietly. Her face crumpled, and she sank into the chair across from me. "It's not what you think," she began, but her voice shook. "Then tell me," I said, my hands trembling. She didn't. Not at first, but eventually the truth spilled out in fits and starts. His name was Ben. They'd met at a networking event months ago. It had started with coffee, then lunches, then more. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I still love you. I got lost." I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew, and felt a strange calm settle over me. "You didn't get lost," I said. "You walked away." The next morning, I packed my things. She didn't try to stop me. As I drove away, I passed the wine bar, its windows glowing in the early morning light. It looked exactly the same as it had the night before, but everything else had changed. Some endings aren't explosions. They're slow leaks, the air escaping one side at a time until there's nothing left to hold on to. Let's start a new story. I didn't notice at first. Why would I? Shadows aren't something you think about. They're just there, stuck to you like an afterthought. It wasn't until I walked past a street lamp on my way home from work that I realized something was off. The light stretched long across the sidewalk, casting the familiar silhouettes of cars, trees, and a stray dog sniffing a fire hydrant. But when I looked down, my shadow wasn't there. I stopped walking. The dog's shadow stretched beside mine, or where mine should have been. I stepped to the side, heart pounding, and watched the dog's shadow move naturally. Mine didn't appear. I spun around, squinting in every direction, searching for some explanation. Maybe the light was weird. Maybe my angle was wrong. But no matter how I moved, there was nothing. Just an empty patch of concrete where my shadow should have been. I hurried home, trying to convince myself it was nothing. An optical illusion. A trick of the light. By the time I reached my apartment, I had almost convinced myself it wasn't worth worrying about. But when I opened the door and flicked on the overhead light, I froze. There was something on the wall. Not my shadow, but a shadow. Tall, thin, and just barely human-shaped, it stretched across the wall opposite me. But it didn't move when I moved. It stayed perfectly still, even when I waved my arms or stepped to the side. It was pinned there like a smear of ink, too sharp around the edges, too dark to feel real. I turned off the light, hoping it would vanish. It didn't. In the dark, it was even worse. I could feel it there, pressed into the corner of the room like a folded thing, waiting. I slept on the couch that night, or at least I tried. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it watching me. The next morning, it was gone, or so I thought. At work, everything seemed normal. I didn't mention it to anyone. It sounded ridiculous, like a bad dream. But when I walked to the break room and past the mirrored wall in the hallway, I stopped cold. My reflection was there. My body, my face, my movements, all perfectly mirrored. But still, no shadow. Behind me, where my shadow should have stretched across the tiled floor, was nothing. That's when I noticed the other reflection. It wasn't behind me. It wasn't even beside me. It was inside the mirror. Something tall and dark, pressed just behind my reflection like an outline sketched in smoke. Its limbs were longer than mine, its head tilted at an impossible angle. And then it moved, not fast, not sudden, but deliberate. It leaned forward, its shadowy hand pressing against the glass like it was testing the barrier. My reflection didn't move at all. I ran out of the building and didn't go back. Over the next few days, I tried to pretend everything was fine, that the mirror was a trick of the light, a fleeting hallucination caused by stress or exhaustion. But the shadow wouldn't let me forget. It started appearing everywhere, on the walls of my apartment, in the reflections of my phone screen, even in the corners of my peripheral vision when I walked down the street. Always still, always silent, and always watching. I tried ignoring it, but it didn't like that. One night I heard it for the first time. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I could sleep. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then I heard the whisper, soft, faint, and barely audible, like a breath dragged through a crack in the wall. "Why did you leave me?" I sat up, heart racing, the whisper echoing in my ears. It didn't come again, but the silence that followed was worse. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I avoided my apartment entirely. I stayed out until well past midnight, wandering the city, trying to drown my thoughts in the noise of people and traffic. But eventually I had to go home. When I opened the door, I knew immediately something had changed. The shadow was no longer still. It moved now, sluggishly at first, dragging itself along the walls like spilled ink. It didn't make a sound, but its presence was deafening, pressing against my mind like static. And then it started to speak, not in whispers this time. Its voice was louder now, clearer. "Why did you leave me?" it asked again. "You can't leave me." I backed into the corner, my knees shaking. "What do you want?" I croaked. It paused, its shape shifting, writhing like it was considering the question. "I want what's mine," it said finally. Before I could ask what it meant, it lunged. The shadow was cold, impossibly cold. and I felt it wrap around me, sinking into my skin like icy water. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then it was gone. Just like that, the room was quiet again. No sado, no whispers. I thought it was over, until I looked in the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, motionless. It looked like me, but it wasn't. Its eyes were wrong. Too dark, too hollow, like they were filled with the same inky blackness as the shadow. And when it smiled, I knew I wasn't the one in control anymore. Let's start a new story. And conveniently close to work. It was an old building, one of those pre-war structures with high ceilings and thick walls. The landlord had renovated just enough to make it livable, but left enough original charm to make it seem like a steal. The first night, I noticed the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but an oppressive stillness, like the building was holding its breath. No street noise, no hum of appliances, not even the distant murmur of neighbors. It was like I'd stepped into a vacuum. It wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it. A faint tapping sound, so light I thought I was imagining it. It came from the wall behind my headboard. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. I sat up, straining to listen, but the noise stopped. The next morning, I asked my landlord if there was anyone living next door. "Nope," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "That unit's empty. Has been for months." I nodded, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. Old buildings make noises, right? Pipes, settling wood, maybe the wind. But it wasn't the pipes. Every night, the tapping came back. Always the same pattern. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. Sometimes it would stop for hours, only to start again just as I was drifting off. One night, I banged on the wall, hoping to scare off whatever it was, a rat, a bird, a figment of my imagination. The tapping stopped, then it started again, but this time it wasn't just behind the wall. It was coming from inside my closet. I didn't open the door. I slept with the lights on that night, my pulse pounding in my ears. The next morning, I checked the closet as soon as the sun came up. Nothing, just clothes, shoes, and the faint scent of mothballs. For a while, I managed to convince myself it was harmless. Annoying, but harmless. Then I found the message. It was carved into the wall behind my headboard, faint but deliberate. I hadn't noticed it before because it was hidden by the bed frame. "Can you hear me?" My stomach dropped. I tried to tell myself it was old, left by a previous tenant. Maybe it had been covered up by paint until now. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I pushed my bed to the opposite wall. I told myself it was just to try something different, a better layout for the room. But I didn't sleep any better, because the tapping followed me. Now it was coming from the ceiling. The next few nights were a blur of paranoia. I started hearing faint whispers in the silence, words I couldn't quite make out. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and lights flickered whenever I stepped into a room. I stopped going home after work. I stayed out as late as I could, drinking coffee in 24-hour diners or wandering aimlessly through the city. But I couldn't avoid the apartment forever. One night, when I finally dragged myself back, there was a note on the floor just inside the door. It wasn't handwritten. It had been typed, the edges of the paper jagged as if torn from a notebook. "Why are you ignoring me?" I searched the entire apartment, every closet, every cabinet, every corner. Nothing. No sign of anyone breaking in. But the note wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the smell. It started faint, like something rotting far away. But over the next few days, it grew stronger. Sour and metallic, like damp earth and rusted iron. I called the landlord again, begging him to check the vents, the pipes, anything. "Lady," he said, his voice tinged with irritation, "I've told you. This is an old building. Things settle, things creak. I don't know what you're smelling, but there's no problem here." There was a problem. That night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. It was soft, shallow, just behind me. I froze, my eyes wide in the darkness. Slowly, I turned my head toward the wall. And that's when I saw it. A crack in the plaster, no wider than a pencil, running vertically along the wall. It hadn't been there before. Something was moving behind it. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding as the breathing grew louder. The crack widened, splitting the wall open like a wound. And then I saw the eye. It was huge, bloodshot, and impossibly human, staring out at me from the darkness behind the wall. I screamed and ran, slamming the door behind me. I didn't go back. Not to pack, not to explain, not for anything. The landlord called a week later, asking why I'd disappeared. Someone's living in that apartment, I told him. Someone in the walls. He laughed. No one's living there. You're imagining things. But he was wrong, because now, in my new place, I hear it again. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. This time, it's coming from the floorboards. Can you hear me? Let's start a new story. There's a room in my house that doesn't exist. I didn't notice it when I first moved in. The house was a steal. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a big backyard in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't in perfect shape, sure, but I figured the creaky floors and peeling wallpaper were worth the price. For the first few months, everything was fine. Normal. Then I found the door. It was in the hallway between my bedroom and the bathroom. A narrow, unassuming thing I hadn't noticed before. At first, I thought I just missed it during the walkthrough. The house was old. Maybe it had been painted shut or stuck. But no, it wasn't locked. The brass knob turned easily. I opened it to find a small, empty room. There wasn't anything remarkable about it. The walls were beige, the floor scuffed with like the rest of the house, and there was a single window that looked out onto the backyard. It wasn't on the floor plan, but I wasn't going to complain. An extra room? Great. I could turn it into an office or a guest space. But when I mentioned it to the realtor, her face went blank. There's no extra room, she said. Yes, there is. It's between the bathroom and the master bedroom. She frowned, shook her head, and pulled out her tablet. She showed me the digital layout. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a kitchen, a living room. No door in the hallway. No extra space. You must be mistaken, she said, smiling nervously. But if you have any concerns, you should contact an inspector. I didn't call an inspector. Instead, I went home and opened the door again. The room was there, just as I'd left it. Bare, still quiet. Something about it was off, though, and it took me a minute to figure out what. The air inside was colder, like stepping into a basement or a walk-in freezer. And the smell, faint, metallic, almost like old blood, made my stomach churn. I decided to close the door and ignore it. For weeks, I didn't touch it. I walked past it every day, trying not to notice the faint draft seeping under the crack, the way the light inside the room always seemed dimmer than the rest of the house. But then strange things started happening. I'd hear faint noises at night, scratches, soft tapping, sometimes even whispers that sounded like they were coming from inside the walls. Lights flickered. Objects I'd placed in one room would turn up in another. Once, I found my watch on the kitchen counter, ticking backward. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding. The steps were slow and deliberate, growing louder as they approached my bedroom door. Then they stopped. I lay there, holding my breath, staring at the door. The doorknob didn't turn. The door didn't creak. But after a long, tense moment, I heard it. A voice. Faint, raspy, just on the other side of the door. Come see. The next morning, I decided to investigate the room again. I don't know what I was expecting. A hidden crawl space, maybe, or some evidence that the room had been added illegally. But when I opened the door, the room wasn't empty anymore. The walls were covered in writing. Not paint, not ink, scratches. Hundreds of deep, jagged scratches carved into the plaster, looping and twisting into words I couldn't understand. The language was unfamiliar, sharp, angular symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them. In the center of the room, a chair I'd never seen before sat perfectly upright, facing the window. The metallic smell was stronger now, almost unbearable. I backed out, slammed the door shut, and locked it. For the next few days, I avoided the hallway altogether. I showered at the gym, slept on the couch, and kept the TV on to drown out the faint noises coming from upstairs. But the room didn't stop. The door rattled at night, as if something inside was testing the handle. Shadows moved under the crack, dark and shifting. Once, I found the door ajar, even though I was certain I'd locked it. Then, 2 nights ago, I woke up to find the door wide open. Light spilled into the hallway, cold and dim, and from where I lay in bed, I could see the chair in the center of the room. There was something sitting in it. At first, I thought it was a person, a man, maybe, or something shaped like one. But the proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move. It just sat there, staring at the wall. And then it turned. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth, featureless, a blank oval of pale, leathery skin. But I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating, pressing against me like a weight. I slammed the bedroom door and pushed my dresser in front of it. I haven't opened the door since. I don't know if the room is still there, but every night, I hear it, the chair creaking, the soft scrape of something sharp against the walls, and the voice, "Come see." Let's start a new story. I first noticed the man in the gray suit when I was waiting for the train. It was Monday morning, and the platform was crowded with the usual mix of commuters. Headphones in, coffee cups in hand, no one making eye contact. But he stood out. He wasn't doing anything strange, exactly, just standing there, his hands in his pockets, staring at the tracks. But his suit looked out of place. It wasn't the kind you see in the city, not modern or slim fit. It was dated, almost antique, with sharp lapels and a faint pinstripe. And his face, I couldn't place why, but something about it seemed wrong. Not deformed or scary, just off. Like someone had described a face to a sculptor who hadn't quite understood what they meant. The train came, and I forgot about him. Until the next day. He was there again, same suit, same stance, same blank expression. He didn't get on the train. He just stood there staring at the tracks, not moving. The third time I saw him, I was convinced he was watching me. It wasn't obvious. He didn't turn his head or make any sudden movements. But every time I glanced in his direction, I felt his gaze, heavy and unblinking, even though his eyes never seemed to leave the tracks. That night, I dreamed of the train. In the dream, I was standing on the platform alone. The air was thick with fog, and the tracks stretched out into darkness. The train pulled in slowly, its brakes screeching louder than they should have, the sound digging into my skull. When the doors opened, the man in the gray suit stepped off. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just smiled. I woke up with his face burned into my mind. The next day, I decided to switch stations. I left home earlier than usual and caught the train from a different part of town, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But when the train arrived, he was there, standing on the platform, waiting. Same suit, same expression. He didn't get on. I almost didn't either. That night, I stayed late at work. I told myself I had deadlines, but the truth was I was scared to go home. When I finally got to the station, the platform was nearly empty. And he was there. This time, he was closer. He wasn't at the edge of the platform anymore. He stood near the benches, his hands still in his pockets, his head tilted slightly like he was listening for something. I kept my distance, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The train came, and I hurried on, choosing a car at the far end of the platform. I found a seat, tried to calm my racing heart, and told myself it was all in my head. But when the train pulled out of the station, I saw him through the window. He was standing on the platform, staring after me, and he was smiling. The dreams got worse after that. Every night, I dreamed of the train. The man in the gray suit was always there, waiting. Sometimes he stepped off the train, his footsteps impossibly loud against the concrete. Sometimes he stayed on board, sitting across from me, his face blank except for that faint, unnatural smile. One night, the dream was different. I was standing in my living room, the air heavy and still. The lights flickered, dimming until I was left in almost complete darkness. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. A whisper. "It's almost time." I woke up gasping, the sound of the whisper echoing in my ears. The next day, I didn't go to work. I didn't go anywhere. I stayed in bed, curtains drawn, phone turned off, determined to avoid whatever was happening to me. But when I finally opened the curtains, he was there, standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment. His hands were still in his pockets, his head tilted just slightly, and he was looking right at me. I shut the curtains and locked every door and window. That night, I didn't dream of the train. I dreamed of the tracks. I was walking along them in complete darkness, the sound of my footsteps drowned out by something else. A low, rhythmic thrum, like machinery waking up. The man in the gray suit walked ahead of me, always just out of reach. I tried to call out to him, but my voice didn't work. The thrum grew louder, and suddenly I realized it wasn't machinery. It was breathing, something massive, just out of sight, breathing slow and deep. When I woke up, the man was inside my apartment. He was standing at the foot of my bed, his smile wider now, impossibly wide, stretching across his face like it didn't belong there. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. He leaned closer, his head tilting further until it seemed ready to snap. "It's time," he whispered. The lights flickered, and he was gone. But when I looked out the window, the train was there. It sat on the street outside my apartment, its doors open, waiting. I don't remember getting on. I only remember the man in the gray suit, sitting across from me, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his smile never fading. The train isn't stopping. The windows show nothing but darkness, and the air feels heavier with every passing second. I think I'm dreaming again, but this time, I don't think I'll wake up. Let's start a new story. The GPS called it Harrow's Edge, but my phone's signal had been spotty for miles, and the place didn't seem to exist outside the cracked screen of my dashboard. I was driving back from a client meeting somewhere deep in the rural Midwest when the storm rolled in. Sheets of rain pounded the windshield, and the road became a narrow, twisting ribbon through dense, shadowy woods. When the gas light came on, I cursed under my breath. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour, let alone a gas station. Just as the anxiety began to bloom, the trees parted, and there it was, a sign, weathered and half-hidden by creeping ivy. "Welcome to Harrow's Edge." I turned down the narrow road, relieved but uneasy. The town didn't feel right. It was too quiet, too empty, like a diorama left to gather dust. Rows of old brick buildings lined the main street, their windows dark. A single gas station sat at the far end, its neon open, sign buzzing faintly in the rain. I pulled in, the tires crunching over gravel, and stepped out into the storm. The air smelled damp and metallic, and the silence was so heavy it seemed to press against my ears. The attendant was inside, a wiry man with hollow cheeks and a look of vague disinterest. "Just passing through?" he asked as I handed him cash. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Yeah," I replied. "Got caught in the storm. Didn't think I'd make it this far." He smirked faintly, but there was no humor in it. "Not many do." I laughed awkwardly, unsure if he was joking, and went back to fill my tank. As I twisted the cap back on, I noticed something, or rather, someone standing at the edge of the lot. A woman. She was drenched from the rain, her dark hair plastered to her face, but she made no move to step out of the downpour. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on me, unblinking. Her clothes were pale, almost colorless, and her skin was the same shade, like an overexposed photograph. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud against the storm. She didn't answer. When I turned back to call for the attendant, she was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur of rain and nerves. I left Harrow's Edge without looking back, eager to put miles between me and that eerie silence. The woman's face lingered in my mind, though, those hollow, staring eyes. It wasn't until I reached my apartment late that night, exhausted and damp, that I realized something was wrong. I didn't remember bringing the envelope inside. It was sitting on my coffee table, cream-colored and crisp, as though it had been placed there moments ago. My apartment was locked, the door chain still in place. I stared at it for a long moment before finally picking it up. There was no address, no stamp, just my name written in spindly handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. "You brought it with you. Return it." I had no idea what it meant, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. My first instinct was to throw the envelope away, to pretend it hadn't happened, but when I went to toss it in the trash, I hesitated. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it carried a weight beyond its size. That night, I dreamed of the woman. She was standing in my bedroom, her soaked hair dripping onto the floor, her eyes darker than I remembered. She didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating, her stare pinning me in place. When I woke, the pillow beneath my head was damp, and the faint smell of rain lingered in the air. The next few days were worse. I started noticing things out of place. My keys weren't where I'd left them. Lights I was sure I'd turned off were burning when I came home. And then there were the noises. Faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the creak of footsteps on the floor above me, even though I lived on the top floor. The second envelope appeared on my desk at work, tucked neatly between a stack of files. This one contained a photograph. It was of the gas station in Harrow's Edge. The image was black and white, grainy, but the woman was there, standing at the edge of the frame, her eyes locked on the camera. The words written on the back sent my heart racing. "It knows where you are." That night, I heard tapping at my window. My apartment is on the 7th floor. I didn't look. I couldn't. Instead, I called the police, trying to explain the strange notes and noises without sounding completely unhinged. They sent an officer to do a welfare check, a woman with a kind voice and a tired smile. She found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. Before she left, she paused in the doorway, her expression shifting to something more serious. "Do you remember anyone following you?" she asked. I shook my head. Her gaze lingered for a moment before she nodded. "Call us if anything changes." By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. I was going back to Harrow's Edge. The drive was suffocating, the weight of anticipation pressing down on my chest with every mile. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bright, cloudless sky, but the town was just as I'd left it. Quiet, empty, and wrong. The gas station was closed this time, its neon sign dark. I parked on the gravel lot and stepped out, the stillness swallowing me whole. It didn't take long to find her. She was standing in the same spot, just beyond the edge of the lot, her pale figure a stark contrast against the bare trees. As I approached, she tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes fixed on me. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice cracking. Her lips moved, but the words weren't meant for my ears. They filled the air around me, pressing against my thoughts, heavy and incomprehensible. Then she pointed. Behind her, the woods stretched endlessly, thick with shadows. But there was a path now, narrow and winding, leading deeper into the trees. I knew better than to follow. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave and never return. But the path called to me, just like the house, just like the town. I stepped forward. Let's start a new story. I didn't notice it at first, the way you don't notice a shadow shifting until it moves just enough to make you look twice. It started with a voicemail. The notification buzzed my phone as I was walking home from work. I rarely get calls, and even more rarely do they go to voicemail, so I stopped on the sidewalk to listen. The recording was short, just a few seconds of static, but beneath it I could hear something faint. My name? Emily. It was barely audible, like a whisper buried in the noise, but it was there. My first thought was it might be a robocall glitching out. I deleted it and moved on. The second voicemail came 2 days later. This time, I answered the phone when it rang, but no one spoke. Just the same static, faint and buzzing, before it cut off. When I checked my voicemail afterward, there was another recording waiting for me. Again, just static. Again, my name whispered beneath it. Emily. I didn't tell anyone about it. What was there to say? It's not illegal to leave creepy voicemails, and besides, I figured it would stop. It was probably some tech glitch or spam caller messing with me. But the calls didn't stop. The third one came at midnight. I had just settled into bed, my apartment dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside my window. The sound of the ringing startled me so badly I almost dropped the phone. When I answered, I didn't hear static this time. Instead, there was breathing, slow and deliberate, like whoever was on the other end was making sure I heard every inhale, every exhale. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The breathing continued, unbroken, until finally a voice spoke. It was mine. "Emily," it said, mimicking the exact way I'd said my name. I hung up so fast I nearly cracked the screen. The next morning, I woke up to find a missed call from the same number. My stomach sank when I noticed the timestamp. 3:33 a.m. I hadn't heard it ring, which meant it must have happened after I'd fallen asleep. There was a voicemail, but I couldn't bring myself to listen. That's when the other things started. It was small at first, easy to dismiss. My keys weren't where I left them. A picture frame on the living room wall tilted just slightly. My alarm clock, which I never touched, reset itself to midnight without explanation. Then there was a reflection. One evening, I was brushing my hair in front of the bathroom mirror when I noticed something off. My reflection was watching me too, intently. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I waved a hand, and the reflection waved back. I turned my head and it followed. But then, when I stopped moving, it didn't. It stared at me, its eyes sharper, darker, like it was sizing me up. I backed away slowly, the mirror image shrinking with distance. Only when I was out of the bathroom did I feel like I could breathe again. I kept the bathroom door shut after that. By the second week, I started hearing footsteps. They weren't loud, just faint enough to make me question whether I was imagining them. They came at random times, usually at night, soft taps crossing the floor above me. The problem was I lived on the top floor. One night, I got brave, or maybe stupid, and shouted at the ceiling. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for them to start again, maybe for silence to follow. What I didn't expect was a knock on my apartment door. 3 sharp raps. I froze. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the building old and mostly empty. My neighbors rarely made noise, and no one had a reason to visit me. I crept toward the door, my breath caught in my throat. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. No response. I checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. Then the knock came again, this time from behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. The apartment was silent, nothing out of place. The air felt colder, though heavy was something I couldn't name. And then I noticed the voicemail icon on my phone. I stared at it for a long time before pressing play. This one wasn't static. It wasn't breathing. It was a voice. My voice. "I'm coming in." That was last night. Now, as I sit here writing this, my apartment feels too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but full. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like I'm not alone. The bathroom door is open again, even though I know Let's start a new story. I take the same path every evening, a quiet stretch of suburban sidewalk lined with trees and warm porch lights. There's a particular comfort in routine, the click of my boots against the pavement, the hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog. But that night, something was different. At first, it was subtle. The air felt heavier, colder, even though it was mid-July. The streetlights flickered faintly as I passed, but only when I looked directly at them. Then I noticed the houses. They weren't wrong exactly, but they weren't right either. The windows, normally alive with the soft glow of TVs or lamps, were dark. No cars sat in the driveways. No voices carried from the porches. It felt like I'd wandered onto the set of an abandoned play. But the strangest thing? There were more houses than usual. The street seemed to stretch farther than I remembered, the row of homes doubling, then tripling. The trees thinned, replaced by endless, identical yards. It was subtle at first, a feeling, not a fact, but with every step, the road ahead seemed to multiply, the curve I expected just out of sight. I stopped walking, turned to look behind me. The houses behind were different too. Their silhouettes seemed sharper, more angular, like someone had sketched them from memory and left out all the details that make a place feel lived in. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but the screen stayed black. Dead. Something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just more houses, stretching endlessly into the dark. Then, faintly I heard it, footsteps. Not mine. They were soft, deliberate, keeping pace with me. Every time I stopped, they stopped. When I started walking again, they did too, their rhythm just a fraction out of sync with mine. "Hello!" I called out, my voice cracking in the silence. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from somewhere up ahead, I heard a faint, raspy whisper. "Turn back." I froze, my heart pounding. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried, as if the air itself was bending to carry the words. I wanted to run, Every instinct screamed at me to turn and bolt. But something about the voice, the way it hung in the air, felt like a challenge. So, of course, I kept walking. The footsteps started again. I tried to quicken my pace, but the houses seemed to stretch on forever, the sidewalks blurring into an endless gray expanse. The trees were gone now, replaced by black sky and rows of identical streetlights that cast no light on the ground. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another house. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't like the others. It was larger, towering above the others like an ancient monolith. Its windows were all wrong, too small, too close together. And the front door was impossibly tall, painted a deep, gleaming black that seemed to absorb the dim light. The footsteps stopped again, but this time I didn't dare turn around. The air around me seemed to hum, a low, vibrating sound that I felt in my chest. The front door opened. It didn't creak or groan like I expected. It was silent, opening smoothly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Something in the shadows shifted, a subtle movement that sent chills racing down my spine. I don't know why I stepped forward. Maybe it was the pull of the house, the way it seemed to lean toward me, daring me to come closer. Or maybe it was the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping like a heartbeat echoing from within. The air grew colder as I approached the door. When I stepped inside, the darkness swallowed me whole. I expected the air to smell musty, like an old attic, but instead, it was sharp, metallic, and damp. The floor beneath me was smooth, cold, and unnervingly solid, like stone. Then the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed, impossibly loud, and the hum that had followed me grew louder, vibrating through my bones. The darkness shifted. It wasn't empty. Figures began to emerge, faint at first, like smoke coiling in the air. They were tall, thin, and their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were being dragged forward by unseen strings. I backed away, my hands fumbling for the door, but it was gone. "You shouldn't have come," one of them said, its voice low and hollow, like the creak of an old door. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure leaned closer, its face, or what should have been a face, shifting and melting, never settling into a solid shape. "You were chosen," it said. "For what?" Another figure stepped forward, its limbs impossibly long, its fingers reaching out toward me. "To stay." The hum grew louder, rising into a deafening roar. The walls around me began to shift, the air growing heavier, pressing against my chest. I screamed. When I woke up, I was back on the sidewalk. The houses were normal again. The streetlights cast their usual warm glow, and the trees swayed gently in the summer breeze. But something was different. My reflection in the windows wasn't mine. It was taller, thinner, with eyes that didn't blink and a mouth that didn't smile. And when I turned to leave, I could still hear the footsteps following me home. Let's start a new story. Remote gas station on the edge of town. The pay was terrible, the hours were worse, and the only customers I saw between midnight and sunrise were truckers and the occasional bleary-eyed traveler. But I needed the money, and it wasn't like I had other options. The gas station sat at the end of a long stretch of highway, surrounded by dense, untamed forest. It had been there for decades, a relic of another time with its flickering neon sign and outdated pumps. The manager, Carl, was a wiry man in his 60s who chain-smoked constantly and never smiled. On my first night, Carl handed me a set of keys and a laminated checklist. He didn't bother with small talk, just tapped the list with a nicotine-stained finger and said, "Follow this. Don't mess up. And if you hear anything strange, don't go outside." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but Carl didn't laugh back. "I mean it," he said, his eyes sharp and serious. "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked." With that, he left, his car disappearing into the darkness. I was alone. The first few nights were uneventful. Boring even. I stocked shelves, cleaned the sticky coffee counter, and occasionally sold cigarettes or gas to passing truckers. The hum of the overhead lights and the soft buzz of the cooler were my only companions. I thought Carl's warning was just some old-timer trying to mess with me. Then came the fourth night. It started just after 2 a.m. when a storm rolled in. The rain came down in sheets, hammering against the windows, and the wind howled like something alive. I was in the back, restocking the drink cooler, when the bell above the door jingled. I stepped out to the counter, expecting to see a trucker shaking off the rain, but the store was empty. The door was still shut, the glass fogged from the humidity outside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty store. No answer, just the sound of the rain pounding against the roof. I shook it off, telling myself I'd imagined the bell, and went back to work. But a few minutes later, it rang again. This time, I was sure I'd heard it. I walked back to the front, slower this time, my heart thudding in my chest. The door was still closed, still locked. The security camera feed showed nothing but empty aisles. I checked the door, rattling it to make sure it was secure. It was, but as I turned to go back to the counter, something caught my eye. There was a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, just barely visible through the rain. It was too dark to make out any details, but they weren't moving, just standing there, facing the gas station. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of instinct than anything else. The figure didn't respond, didn't even flinch. They just stood there, perfectly still. I grabbed the cordless phone from the counter and dialed the number Carl had written on the back of my checklist. He picked up after 2 rings. "What is it?" he rasped, sounding like he'd just woken up. "There's someone outside," I said, glancing back at the window. The figure was still there, a dark silhouette against the rain. "I don't know what they want, but they're just standing there." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Carl spoke again, his voice was tense. "Lock the doors. Don't go outside. Whatever you do, don't open the door." I opened my mouth to ask why, but Carl hung up. The figure was closer now. I hadn't seen them move, but they were no longer at the edge of the lot. They were standing at the first gas pump, their face still obscured by the rain and shadows. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting the room in brief bursts of darkness. I clutched the phone, my fingers shaking, but I didn't know who to call. The police? And tell them what? That someone was standing in the rain? The bell above the door jingled. The door was still locked. I checked it 3 times, rattling the handle just to be sure. But the bell had rung, clear as day. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and when they came back on, the figure was standing at the window. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. They were pressed against the glass, their face inches from the pane. It was wrong. Too smooth, like wax stretched over bone. Their eyes were black pits, deep and empty, and their mouth was a thin line that twisted into something resembling a smile. The lights flickered again, and they were gone. I don't remember much after that. I must have locked myself in the supply closet, because that's where Carl found me the next morning, curled up on the floor with the phone clutched to my chest. He didn't ask what happened. He just helped me to my feet, handed me a cup of coffee, and told me to go home. I quit that day. I didn't tell anyone why, didn't try to explain the figure or the bells or the lights. I just left. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the bell above the door. And when I look out my window, I swear I see a figure standing at the edge of the street, watching, waiting. I never go outside. Let's start a new story. It was a rental, an old 2-story place in a sleepy neighborhood, the kind of house that had personality, or so the landlord had said. Personality was just his way of dressing up the cracks in the walls and the warped wood floors. But the price was right, and I needed a place fast, so I didn't ask too many questions. The house was unremarkable at first. It creaked when the wind blew, the lights flickered occasionally, and there was always a faint smell of mildew, no matter how many candles I burned. Normal old house problems. Until I found the room. It wasn't on the initial walkthrough, or if it was, I hadn't noticed it. But one morning, while unpacking boxes, I saw a door I hadn't remembered seeing before. It was small, almost child-sized, set into the wall at the end of the upstairs hallway. At first, I thought it might be an old closet. Curious, I tried the handle, but it didn't budge. Locked. I went about my day, telling myself it wasn't worth worrying about. But the door nagged at me. Every time I passed it, I felt a faint pull, like it was quietly daring me to try again. That night, As I lay in bed, I swore I heard something on the other side. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. I sat up, listening, but it stopped as soon as I moved. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I called the landlord to ask about the door. He hesitated, then laughed nervously. "Oh, that," he said. "Yeah, don't worry about it. It's just an old storage space. I don't even have the key anymore. You'll probably forget it's there after a while." I didn't. The scraping sound came back the next night, louder this time. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. The sound stopped. Then, faintly from the other side came a soft knock. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and locked myself in my bedroom. For the next few days, I avoided the door as much as possible. But no matter where I was in the house, I could feel it. Its presence heavy, oppressive, always in the back of my mind. The scraping and knocking grew more frequent, more insistent. One night, I woke to find a key on my nightstand. It was old and tarnished, the kind of key you'd see in an antique shop. My stomach turned as I picked it up, its weight cold and heavy in my hand. I knew exactly what it was for. I tried to resist. I told myself to throw the key away, to leave the door alone. But something wouldn't let me. The pull was stronger now, almost physical. I felt it every time I walked down the hallway, tugging at me, urging me to come closer. Finally, I gave in. The key slid into the lock with a click that echoed too loudly in the empty house. I hesitated, my hand trembling, then turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into the dark. That didn't make sense. I was on the second floor. There shouldn't have been anywhere for the stairs to lead. I stood there, staring into the blackness, my heart pounding. The air was colder here, damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. "Hello?" I called again, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. Against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I stepped through the door. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, the darkness swallowing me whole. I counted each step, trying to anchor myself to something, but by the time I reached 20, I knew I was far deeper than I should have been. Then I saw it. The room at the bottom of the stairs was small and bare, the walls made of smooth, dark stone that didn't match the house's architecture at all. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, and on the chair sat a figure. At first, I thought it was a mannequin. Its body was stiff and unnatural, the joints bent at odd angles. But then it turned its head, and I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. Its skin was smooth and featureless, stretched too tightly over a hollow skull. Its head tilted as if studying me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel it watching me. "You came," it said, its voice a dry rasp that sounded like two stones grinding together. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It stood slowly, its limbs unfolding with a sickening crack. "I've been waiting," it said, stepping toward me. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the bottom step. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head again, and for a moment, I thought it might answer. Then it lunged. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, the cold night air burning my lungs. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't call the landlord. I just left, but the door didn't stay behind. The other night, I woke up in my new apartment to find it waiting for me, nestled against the far wall. And now, every night, I hear the scraping. Let's start a new story. The first time I noticed the staircase, it shouldn't have been there. I live in an old apartment complex, the kind with creaky floors and thin walls where you can hear your neighbors' lives bleeding into your own. My unit is on the third floor, at the end of a long hallway that dead ends in a fire exit. I've walked that hallway every day for the last 2 years, so I know it like the back of my hand. Except that night, the fire exit was gone. In its place was a staircase. It wasn't a modern staircase, like the ones you'd expect in a building like mine. No, this one was old, polished wood, its banisters carved with intricate patterns that might have once been beautiful, but were now chipped and worn. It spiraled downward into darkness, disappearing below the level of the ground floor. I stood there, blinking, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn? No, that was impossible. My building isn't a maze. And yet the staircase was there, impossibly out of place, waiting for me to notice it. My instincts screamed to turn around, but curiosity dragged me forward. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. The air around the staircase was heavier, cooler, carrying the faint smell of wood polish and something metallic, like old coins. I leaned over the banister, peering down. The steps twisted out of sight, but somewhere deep below, I thought I heard something. A faint scraping like wood shifting under weight. I should have walked away. I should have turned and gone back to my apartment, locked the door, and ignored whatever impossible thing this was. Instead, I stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned faintly under my weight, but it held. I took another step, then another. The world around me seemed to shift with every step, the sound of my breathing louder, the air cooler. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the hallway behind me, but it wasn't there. The stairs stretched upward into darkness now, the walls narrowing as if the space were folding in on itself. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I should have turned back then, but something compelled me to keep going. The scraping sound grew louder as I descended, interspersed with faint whispers that seemed to echo from every direction. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they tugged at something deep in my mind, a sense of familiarity that made no sense. Finally, the staircase opened into a small landing. The air here was colder still, and the metallic smell was stronger. In the center of the landing was a door. It was tall and narrow, made of dark wood with iron hinges that gleamed faintly in the dim light. The surface was etched with symbols I didn't recognize, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The door had no handle. I stared at it, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The whispers were louder now, coalescing into something almost intelligible. I stepped closer, drawn to the door like a moth to flame. And then from the other side, I heard it, a knock. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. 3 sharp, precise raps that sent a jolt of fear through me. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The whisper stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy and oppressive. Then the knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the narrow landing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. The door shuddered, the wood groaning under the force of another knock. "Don't open it." The voice was so close that I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me. But the staircase was empty, spiraling up into endless shadow. "Don't open it," the voice said again. It was a whisper, soft but urgent, threading through my mind like it had always been there. The door shuddered again, and I took another step back, my heart pounding. Then suddenly the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my skull, a thick, suffocating nothingness that made my ears ring. And then the door began to open. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the wood creaked as the door swung inward. Beyond it was darkness, impenetrable and alive, the kind of darkness that swallowed light and sound. And in that darkness, something moved. I couldn't see it, not fully, but I felt it, a presence, immense and suffocating, watching me with a focus that made my skin crawl. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices that didn't belong to anyone. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but their meaning was clear. "Come closer." I stepped back, my foot slipping on the edge of the stair. My hand shot out, gripping the banister as I fought to keep my balance. The presence in the darkness shifted, stretching toward me like smoke given form. Then, without thinking, I turned and ran. The stairs seemed endless as I climbed, my lungs burning, my legs trembling with every step. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more desperate. "Don't look back," the voice whispered again. I didn't. When I finally reached the top, I stumbled into the hallway of my building, gasping for air. The fire exit was back where it should have been, the staircase gone as if it had never existed. I slammed the door to my apartment and locked it, my hands shaking. For days, I couldn't bring myself to walk down that hallway. Every time I passed it, I felt the air grow colder, the faint smell of wood polish and metal brushing against my senses. I told myself it was over, that whatever I'd seen was gone. But last night, I woke to the sound of knocking. Not at my front door, at the closet in my bedroom, 3 sharp, deliberate raps. And I swear, in the silence that followed, I heard the faintest whisper. Come closer. Let's start a new story. I should have said no. The job sounded too good to be true. It was a freelance gig I'd found through a small, obscure listing, seeking transcriptionists for historical audio archives. Remote. Pays généreusement. Non-disclosure agreement required. The email came minutes after I applied. They liked my qualifications, they said. The pay was double what I'd expected. I needed the money. Rent was due, and my last client hadn't paid up. The offer seemed straightforward enough. Listen to old recordings, type them up, and send the transcriptions back. Simple. The first file arrived later that night, attached to a curt email. Begin immediately. Use headphones. The file was labeled session 001.wave. I put on my headphones, hit play, and got to work. At first, it was exactly what I expected, grainy, decades-old audio that hissed and popped like a worn vinyl record. A man's voice came through, calm and clinical. Session 1, he began. Subject, patient 42A. Initial interview. Then came another voice. A woman's. It was quiet, trembling. Where am I? She asked. You're safe, the man replied, his tone detached. Please state your name. I don't remember, the woman whispered. The recording continued, a back and forth that felt more like an interrogation than an interview. The woman couldn't recall anything about herself. Not her name, her age, or where she was from. The man asked questions methodically, and she answered with increasing confusion and fear. Then, at around the 7-minute mark, the woman stopped responding. Patient 42A, the man prompted, his tone firmer. Do you hear me? There was silence. Then a faint sound, not from the woman, but from somewhere else in the recording. A low hum, almost imperceptible, like the static had come alive. The man's voice wavered. Do you hear that? The woman's breathing quickened. It's here, she said. What's here? The hum grew louder. It wasn't static anymore. It was rhythmic, almost like a voice trying to form words. The recording ended abruptly. I took off the headphones, my skin prickling. It was unsettling, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. I typed up the transcript, sent it back, and figured that was the end of it. The next day, another file arrived. Session 002.wave. This time, the man's voice was strained. Session 2, he began. Patient 42A. Follow-up. The woman was crying. I don't want to go back, she said. Go back where? It's dark, she whispered. And cold. I can feel it watching me. Patient 42A, the man said, his voice tight. There is nothing watching you. You're in a safe environment. The hum returned, louder than before. This time, it was accompanied by something else. Faint whispers in the background, too soft to make out but unmistakably there. The man's tone shifted, becoming urgent. Do you hear that? What is that sound? The woman screamed. The audio cut out. I couldn't stop shaking as I transcribed the session. The whispers had wormed their way into my mind, looping endlessly, just out of reach. When I sent the file back, I hesitated before opening the next email. It contained a single line, do not stop. Session 003.wave attached. I almost quit right then, but curiosity and desperation kept me going. I opened the file. The man's voice was different now. Frantic, panicked. Session 3, he said, his words tumbling over each other. Patient 42A. Final interview. The woman didn't respond. Patient 42A, he said again, his voice cracking. Please say something. There was a long pause, broken only by the man's shaky breathing. Then came the whispers, clearer now, overlapping, their words sharp and unnatural. The man screamed, No, no, stay back. The whispers swelled, rising into a deafening roar. And then silence. The recording ended. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. My room felt too quiet, too still. I sent the transcript back, my fingers trembling, and decided that was it. I couldn't do another one. But the next email came almost immediately. Final session. Session 004.wave. I deleted it. Or at least, I thought I did. But when I checked my desktop, the file was still there, blinking like a taunt. Against every instinct, I clicked it. The recording began, but it wasn't the man's voice this time. It was mine. Session 4, I said, my voice calm, clinical. Subject, patient 42A. My heart stopped. I didn't remember recording this. I didn't remember saying those words. Then came the woman's voice. Where am I? My voice replied, you're safe. Please state your name. I don't remember, she whispered. The hum returned, louder than ever. The whispers were screaming now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo inside my head. It's here, the woman said, her voice breaking. It's always been here. The recording ended, but the hum didn't. It was still there, filling my room, vibrating in my chest. And then I heard it, a whisper. Close. Too close. Your turn. The screen went black. I don't sleep anymore. I don't leave my apartment. The hum is always there, faint but constant, and the whispers are getting louder. Yesterday, a new file appeared on my computer. No email, no explanation. Just a file labeled Session 005.wave. I'm too afraid to open it, but I know I will. Let's start a new story. I noticed it one morning while brushing my teeth. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. My reflection moved like normal, raising its hand when I did, leaning forward as I leaned forward. But then, for a split second, it hesitated. When I turned my head to the right, it lagged behind, its head moving a fraction of a second later than mine. It snapped back into sync almost immediately, and I told myself it was nothing. I was tired, half asleep, except it kept happening. By the end of the week, I couldn't deny it anymore. Every time I looked in the mirror, the delay became more pronounced. If I raised my hand, my reflection would pause for just a moment before mimicking the motion, like it was playing a game I wasn't in on. The worst part wasn't the lag. It was the way it looked at me. Its eyes weren't quite right. They were mine, but they held an intensity that made my skin crawl. When it moved, it wasn't just copying me, it was watching me. And then it started doing things I wasn't doing. I was washing my hands one night, avoiding the mirror entirely, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My reflection had turned its head. I hadn't moved. My hands were still under the faucet, but in the mirror, I was staring at myself. I froze, water running over my fingers, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I looked up. The reflection was back to normal, mimicking my every move. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. The next day, I covered the mirror with a towel. It didn't help. I started noticing other reflective surfaces. The TV when it was off, the glass of the picture frames on the walls, even the shine of my phone screen. Every time I passed by, I could feel it. I didn't dare look too long, but once, when I glanced at my blank laptop screen, I swear I saw it staring at me. Its head tilted slightly, its mouth stretched into the faintest hint of a smile. I tried telling myself I was imagining things. Stress, lack of sleep, maybe even hallucinations. But then it started leaving me messages. The first was on my bathroom mirror. I'd removed the towel to clean it, trying to convince myself that ignoring the problem was only making it worse. But when I finished scrubbing and stepped back, I saw the words. Do you remember? They were faint, written in the fog left behind from my shower, even though I hadn't taken one yet that morning. I wiped the mirror clean and left the bathroom, my heart racing. The second message came 2 nights later. This time, it wasn't on the mirror. It was on the screen of my phone. I'd fallen asleep with it on my nightstand, the screen dark. When I woke up, the words were there, glowing faintly in white text against the black background. I'm waiting. I couldn't turn the phone off. The power button didn't respond, and the text wouldn't go away. I shoved the phone in a drawer and spent the rest of the day avoiding reflective surfaces. By the time I checked again, the message was gone. But it left something else behind. My lock screen photo had changed. It used to be a picture of my dog, a goofy snapshot of him grinning in the park. Now, it was a picture of me. Not a selfie. Not a photo I'd ever taken. In it, I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring directly into the camera, my expression blank. I live alone. That night, I covered every reflective surface in my apartment. I used towels, bedsheets, whatever I could find. The TV, the windows, even the glass on the picture frames. Everything was hidden. But the next morning, they were uncovered. Every towel, every sheet, neatly folded and stacked on my couch. The mirrors were spotless. And in the bathroom mirror, another message. You can't hide. I don't remember the last time I slept. I started hearing it at night, faint at first, like someone pacing in the next room. The sound grew louder as the nights went on. Footsteps, soft tapping, the occasional creak of the floorboards outside my bedroom door. I thought I was going insane, but then last night I heard it whisper. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my breath shallow and uneven. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. And then, let me in. The voice was soft, raspy, and so close it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then I heard it again, louder this time. Let me in. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the bedroom mirror was uncovered. I swear I covered it. I know I covered it. But there it was, and in the faint light of the room, I could see my reflection standing there. It wasn't lying down like I was. It was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. This morning, I found another message, written in the steam on the bathroom mirror. Tonight, I don't know what it wants, but I think it's going to take it. Let's start a new story. I was helping clear out my grandmother's attic after she passed, a task no one in the family wanted, given the decades of hoarding and dust up there. She'd lived alone in that old house for as long as I could remember, the air inside always tinged with mothballs and a peculiar sweet rot. The attic was the worst of it. Boxes upon boxes of clothes, photo albums, old toys, and knickknacks were piled so high it felt like stepping into a maze. That's when I saw it. The mannequin stood at the far end of the room, partially hidden beneath a sheet. At first, I thought it was just one of those old dressmaker forms. Headless, armless, something my grandmother might have used in her younger days. But when I pulled the sheet away, I realized it wasn't a dress form at all. It was human-shaped, too lifelike to be decorative. The mannequin was tall, its surface pale and smooth like polished porcelain. It had a face, not just a blank, featureless oval, but a fully sculpted face, complete with high cheekbones and thin, arched eyebrows. The eyes, though, were what stopped me in my tracks. They weren't painted or molded like the rest of it. They were glassy and wet, glimmering faintly in the dim attic light. They looked real. I should have left it there, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached out to touch its arm, half expecting it to feel like cold plastic or fiberglass. Instead, it was unnervingly warm, almost as if it were alive. I yanked my hand back, a chill running down my spine. What the hell was Grandma doing with this thing? I muttered, shaking my head. I couldn't leave it up there. I didn't want to throw it away either. Something about it felt significant. So I hauled it downstairs and tucked it into the corner of the garage, draping a sheet back over it. That night, I had the first dream. In the dream, I was back in the attic. The boxes were gone, and the room was empty except for the mannequin. It stood in the center of the space, its glassy eyes fixed on me, its lips slightly parted as though it were about to speak. I couldn't move. The attic felt suffocating, the air heavy and hot. The mannequin's face began to change, its smooth surface shifting subtly, its features growing sharper, more human. Its lips moved. "Don't let it out," it whispered, its voice soft and raspy. I woke with a jolt, my chest tight. The next morning, I tried to push the dream from my mind. I told myself it was just my imagination, a product of spending too much time in a creepy old attic. But when I stepped into the garage, I noticed something strange. The sheet had slipped off the mannequin during the night. It was standing exactly where I'd left it, but now its head was tilted slightly to the side, as though it were watching me. I felt my pulse quicken. The garage was locked. No one else had been in the house. I approached it cautiously, my stomach churning. "Did you move?" I muttered, half laughing at myself. Of course it didn't respond. I draped the sheet back over it and left the garage, locking the door behind me. That night, the dream came again. This time, I wasn't in the attic. I was in the garage, standing in the dark. The mannequin was there too, but it wasn't standing in the corner. It was walking, its movements slow and deliberate, its glassy eyes glinting in the faint light filtering through the windows. Its lips moved again. "You shouldn't have taken me," it whispered. When I woke, I found scratches on my arms, thin, shallow lines, as though I'd brushed against something sharp. The mannequin was still in the garage, its position unchanged. But the air in the house felt different now, heavier, colder. Over the next few days, things escalated. I started hearing noises at night. The soft scrape of something dragging across the floor, faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Doors I knew I'd closed would be open in the morning. Lights flickered unpredictably, plunging the house into moments of suffocating darkness. And then I noticed the footprints. They appeared in the dust on the floor, leading from the garage to the hallway and back again. They were small, bare, and perfectly formed, as though someone had been walking around while I slept. But I lived alone. I tried getting rid of the mannequin. I drove it to the edge of town and dumped it at a junkyard, leaving it propped against a pile of scrap metal. I didn't look back. When I got home, the house felt lighter. The air was warmer, the oppressive silence lifted. For the first time in days, I thought I'd finally rid myself of whatever curse I'd unleashed. But when I woke the next morning, it was back. The mannequin was standing in the corner of my bedroom, its head tilted toward me, its glassy eyes unblinking. Its lips moved. "You can't leave me," it said. This time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was loud, clear, and close. I ran. I left the house that day, taking nothing with me but my car keys and a duffel bag of clothes. I didn't even lock the door. That was weeks ago. I'm staying in a motel now, but I don't feel any safer. Last night, I heard footsteps outside my door. When I checked, there was nothing there. But this morning, I found a single glass ice sitting on the nightstand. It's watching me. Let's start a new story. A sprawling, crumbling estate deep in the woods, miles away from anything resembling civilization. It had been in our family for generations, a creaking monument to bad luck and whispered tragedies. My parents never talked about it, other than to say, "That place is cursed." But I didn't believe in curses. I believed in opportunity. The house was free, and I needed a place to stay after my divorce. Fixing it up seemed like the perfect distraction. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, suffocating kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. The trees pressed in close around the house, their gnarled branches tangling above the roof. The house itself was massive, a hulking Victorian, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It didn't look welcoming. It looked hungry. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and mildew. The floors groaned under my weight as I walked through, and the walls seemed to lean in, as if they were listening. But it wasn't the house that unsettled me the most. It was the mirror. I found it in the foyer, leaning against the wall beneath the grand staircase. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, with an ornate gold frame that had tarnished to a dull green. The glass was cloudy, but even so, I could see my reflection staring back at me. There was something odd about it, though, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I thought about moving it, but it was heavy, too heavy for me to lift on my own. So I left it there, figuring I'd deal with it later. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, and every creak and groan of the old wood sounded like footsteps. Around midnight, I gave up trying and went downstairs for a glass of water. The kitchen was at the back of the house, down a narrow hallway that felt longer in the dark. As I passed the mirror, I glanced at it out of habit. My reflection didn't move. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My reflection was still there, but it wasn't following my movements. It stood completely still, staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Its expression was wrong, too blank, almost curious, like it was studying me. I blinked, and it was gone. My reflection moved as it should, perfectly mirroring me as I stepped closer. I told myself I was just tired, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched lingered. The next morning, I decided to move the mirror. I didn't care how heavy it was. I didn't want it in the house anymore. But when I tried to lift it, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the thing was bolted to the floor, though there were no screws or nails holding it down. I even tried pushing it over, but it stayed stubbornly upright, unmoving. Frustrated, I covered it with an old sheet and left for the hardware store. I figured I'd buy a hammer or crowbar, something to help me pry it loose. But when I came back, the sheet was gone and the mirror was clean. The glass, which had been cloudy before, now gleamed as if it had been polished. My reflection stared back at me, and for a moment, I thought it smiled. That night, the dream started. I dreamed of the mirror. In the dream, I was standing in front of it, my reflection staring back at me. But it wasn't me. Not really. Its movements were just slightly off, a split-second delay between my actions and its mimicry. The longer I stared, the worse it got. Its smile grew too wide, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Then, it pressed its hand against the glass, and the glass gave way. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, but the air felt wrong, charged like a storm was about to break. I forced myself out of bed, telling myself it was just a nightmare, and went downstairs for a drink. The mirror was waiting for me. It wasn't in the foyer anymore. It had moved to the living room, leaning against the wall across from the fireplace. I didn't know how it had gotten there. It was too heavy for me to move, and I hadn't called anyone to help. My chest tightened as I approached it, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My reflection stared back at me, perfectly still. I reached out to touch the glass, half expecting it to be warm. It wasn't. It was ice cold, colder than it had any right to be. My breath fogged the surface as I leaned closer, trying to see if there was anything behind it. And that's when it moved. Not me. The reflection. It raised its hand, pressing it against the glass. Its mouth stretched into that too wide smile, and its eyes seemed to darken, the pupils bleeding into the whites until they were nothing but black pits. "Let me out," it whispered. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The reflection didn't follow. It just stood there, its hand pressed against the glass, its smile frozen. I grabbed a blanket from the couch and threw it over the mirror, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for a long time after that. The mirror wouldn't leave. No matter what I did, covering it, avoiding it, even trying to smash it with a hammer, it stayed intact, its surface unbroken, its reflection watching me. I started hearing things, too. Faint whispers, always just at the edge of hearing, like voices coming from inside the glass. And then the dreams started bleeding into reality. One night, I woke to find myself standing in front of the mirror, my hand pressed against the glass. My reflection smiled at me, its black eyes gleaming. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, but when I finally pulled away, my palm left a mark on the glass. A perfect handprint. I left the house the next morning. I didn't pack. I didn't look back. But the mirror isn't done with me. Wherever I go, I see it. Reflected in windows, in puddles, in the darkened screens of TVs. My reflection, smiling that too wide smile, pressing its hand against the glass. Waiting. Let's start a new story. Notifications. Most were emails, but one stood out. An unknown number. I nearly deleted it. I never answer unknown calls, but something stopped me. The voicemail was short, only 7 seconds of silence. No breathing, no static. Just nothing. I should have ignored it. Instead, I hit play again, listening closer. It was only on the third replay that I noticed it. A faint sound buried deep beneath the silence. It wasn't a voice exactly. It was more like a melody, distant and broken, like it had been recorded underwater. A chill crept up my spine. I replayed it one last time before deleting it, chalking it up to a bad connection or a prank. But that night, when I lay in bed, I couldn't get the sound out of my head. It felt familiar, but I couldn't place why. The second voicemail came the next day. Same unknown number. Same 7 seconds of silence. This time, though, the faint melody was clearer, like it had moved closer. I didn't delete it right away. Instead, I saved it and set my phone down, staring at it like it might explain itself. The call started coming daily after that. Always the same number. Always the same voicemail. By the end of the week, the melody had grown louder. It wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate, a haunting sequence of notes that curled in my ears long after the message ended. That's when the dreams began. In the first one, I was standing in a forest, though the trees were wrong. Their trunks were too dark, their branches too low, and their leaves shimmered faintly, like the surface of a black lake. The melody from the voicemail drifted through the air, pulling me deeper into the woods. I didn't want to follow it, but I couldn't stop myself. At the center of the forest was a well. It was ancient, the stones crumbling with moss and age. The melody came from inside it, a low, mournful sound echoing up from the darkness. I leaned over the edge, peering down into the well, and something leaned back. Its face was pale, almost luminous, but its features were blurred, like they'd been smudged out of focus. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them watching me. When it smiled, I woke up gasping for air. The next morning, the voicemail was waiting for me again. The melody had changed. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a voice. It spoke my name, softly, almost tenderly. Anna. I dropped my phone, my pulse racing. I tried blocking the number, but the calls kept coming. I tried deleting the voicemails, but every time I did, they reappeared in my inbox. I even swapped phones, convinced it was a tech issue, but it followed me there too. The dreams grew worse. The forest became a constant. No matter how hard I tried to wake myself up, I always ended up back there, standing before the well. And the thing inside it? It was climbing higher. Each dream, it was closer to the surface, its face sharpening, its hands gripping the crumbling edge of the stones. It didn't speak, but I could feel it. It wanted something. The real world started unraveling. I began seeing things in my apartment, a shadow moving across the wall when nothing was there, a faint whisper behind me when I was alone. The melody from the voicemails followed me everywhere, threading through the hum of the fridge and the rush of the shower. One night, I woke up to find my phone on my pillow, the latest voicemail playing on a loop. This time, the voice didn't just say my name. It said, "Come back." The dreams gave me no choice. That night, I was back in the forest, standing at the edge of the well. The thing inside it wasn't hiding anymore. It was waiting for me. Its arms were impossibly long, its pale fingers curling over the lip of the well like spider legs. Its face had sharpened into something almost human, but its eyes were empty sockets. "Come closer," it whispered. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me shifted, dragging me toward the well. The melody grew louder, drowning out the sound of my own screams. When I woke up, there was dirt under my nails and leaves in my hair, and my phone was ringing. This time, I answered it. The voice on the other end wasn't distant anymore. It was clear, low, and painfully familiar. Anna, it said, "It's your turn." The call ended, but the melody stayed. I can't escape it now. It's in every corner of my life, in the whispers of the wind, in the hum of the city. And the dreams? I don't think they're dreams anymore. Last night, I found dirt on the floor of my bedroom, leading to my bed. And this morning, when I checked my phone, the voicemail wasn't from an unknown number anymore. It was from mine. The message was short. Just 3 words. "Let it in. I think tonight I will. Let's start a new story." Ashy. Just a picture of a lighthouse, its beam cutting through a watercolor sky. It arrived in our mailbox without a return address, addressed to Maya in looping, unfamiliar handwriting. The message on the back read, "Thinking of you. Always." No name. Just those 3 words. She opened it at the counter while I was cooking dinner. Her reaction barely a flicker. Weird," she said, tossing it into the drawer with takeout menus and half-dead pens. "Probably some spam thing." I wasn't convinced. The handwriting didn't look like a marketer's scrawl, and there was something about the tone. Intimate, deliberate. But I said nothing. After all, it was just a postcard. The second sign was the perfume. Maya had worn the same scent for years, a soft, citrusy fragrance that clung to her like second nature. But one evening, she came home from work smelling different. It was floral, musky with a hint of spice. Not bad, just unfamiliar. "You change perfumes?" I asked as she hung up her coat. She hesitated for the briefest moment, then laughed. "Oh yeah, someone at work brought samples. Figured I'd try something new." It was plausible, and I wanted to believe her. But as the days passed, the new scent lingered. It wasn't just an experiment. It was deliberate, like she was trying to mark a new version of herself. Then there were the absences. Maya, who used to curl up next to me on lazy Sundays binge-watching terrible reality TV, started spending more time out. She said it was for errands or catching up with friends, but she always returned with empty hands, her explanations vague. One night, I offered to join her on a quick coffee run, but she shook her head. "It's just a me thing," she said, smiling like it was supposed to soften the blow. "You wouldn't enjoy it." The distance between us grew slowly, like water creeping under a closed door. She was there, but not entirely. Her phone, once left on the counter without a second thought, now rarely left her hand. She smiled at texts she didn't share, her laughter soft and private. And then, one evening, I noticed a name flash across her screen: Daniel. I didn't ask her about it. Instead, I waited, watching as patterns emerged. Late nights, more absences, and then the final piece, the ring. I found it in the pocket of her jacket while searching for the keys she'd misplaced. It wasn't hers. Maya didn't wear rings, not even costume jewelry. This one was simple, a gold band with a small inscription inside: forever. When she came home that night, I placed it on the counter between us. "Want to tell me about this?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw the truth flash across her face. Panic, guilt, 1,000 explanations scrambling for purchase. But she recovered quickly. "Oh, that's Allison's," she said, her tone light. "She left it in my car the other day. I was supposed to give it back." It wasn't a bad lie. It might have even worked if I hadn't already called Allison earlier that week, wondering if she and Maya had plans. They didn't. The next morning, I left for work as usual, but instead of heading to the office, I parked outside the cafe Maya claimed to frequent. I waited. At 10:45, her car pulled into the lot. She wasn't alone. Daniel stepped out of the passenger side, holding the door for her like it was second nature. He was tall, well-dressed, with a casual confidence that made my stomach churn. They walked inside together, their movements easy and synchronized. I followed a few minutes later, sitting at a table far enough away to avoid detection. I watched as they leaned toward each other, sharing quiet laughs. He reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she let him. I didn't confront her then. I couldn't. Instead, I left the cafe and sat in my car, staring at the dashboard as my mind raced. This was it, the thing I'd been avoiding, the truth I hadn't wanted to face. She wasn't just distracted or tired. She wasn't just trying something new. She was somewhere else entirely with him. When she came home that evening, I was waiting for her. She set her bag down and smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We need to talk," I said. Her expression faltered, and she sat across from me at the table. "What's wrong?" I slid the ring across the surface toward her. "It's not Allison's," I said, "and you know it." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she picked up the ring, turning it over in her hand. Her shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. "I didn't want it to get to this," she said softly. "To what?" I asked, my voice tight. "To the point where you find out like this," she said. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how." "Tell me what?" I demanded, though I already knew. She hesitated, then met my eyes. "It's Daniel," she said. "It started a few months ago. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did." I finished for her, my voice cold. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Are you?" I asked, standing up. "Or are you just sorry you got caught?" I didn't wait for an answer. I grabbed my keys, walked out the door, and didn't look back. The next morning, the lily was gone from the drawer, and so was she. Some endings don't require shouting or slammed doors. They just fade, like a postcard left in the rain, its words smudged into nothing. Let's start a new story. Picture tucked inside a used book at a shop downtown. The book itself was unremarkable, an old paperback mystery with a torn cover. But the photo slipped out when I opened it, landing face up on the floor. It was black and white, slightly creased, and clearly old. A young girl stood in the center of the frame, maybe 9 or 10 years old, wearing a white dress with lace trim. Her hair was pulled back in tight curls, and her face was blank, almost unnervingly so. No smile, no frown, just a vacant, glassy stare that made my skin crawl. The background was indistinct, blurred like the camera hadn't focused properly, but I could make out a fence and what looked like bare trees. I don't know why I didn't leave the photo there. Maybe it was curiosity, or the way the girl's expression lingered in my mind. Or maybe it was the writing on the back. Scrawled in uneven, shaky handwriting were 3 words. Do you remember? I slipped the photo back into the book and bought it on impulse. The cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, gave me a strange look as she rang it up. "That's an old one," she said, gesturing at the book. I nodded, forcing a smile, and left. When I got home, I placed the photo on my desk and forgot about it for a while. Life was busy, full of deadlines and errands, and the kind of mundane distractions that make time slip through your fingers. But that night, when the apartment was quiet and the world felt smaller, I picked it up again. There was something about the girl that unnerved me. It wasn't just her blank expression, it was her eyes. The longer I looked at them, the less they felt like part of the photograph. They seemed too sharp, too focused, as if they weren't just looking out from the picture, but looking at me. I turned the photo over again. "Do you remember?" "No, I thought." "I don't." I left it on the desk and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept dreaming about the girl. In the dream, she wasn't in the photograph anymore. She was standing at the edge of a forest, her white dress stark against the darkness of the trees. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with those hollow, glassy eyes. When I woke up, the photo was no longer on the desk. I found it on the floor, lying face up by the window. The air in the apartment felt colder, and for a moment, I told myself it was just the draft from the poorly sealed windows. But when I picked up the photo, I noticed something new. The background had changed. It wasn't blurred anymore. The fence and trees were still there, but now I could make out a shadowy figure standing behind the girl. It was faint, almost invisible, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It stood just beyond the fence, tall and narrow, its shape warped like a smudge on the film. I set the photo down and stared at it, my pulse quickening. Had the figure always been there, and I just hadn't noticed? No, that wasn't possible. The background had been blurred, indistinct. I was sure of it. I tried to forget about the photo. I shoved it into a drawer and spent the day convincing myself it was nothing, just a trick of light or my imagination playing with old, decaying film. But that night, the dreams returned. The girl was closer now, still at the edge of the forest, but only a few steps away. Her face was sharper, her eyes more vivid. I tried to move, to step back, but my feet wouldn't obey. Behind her, the shadowy figure loomed closer. When I woke, I found the photo on my nightstand. The figure was clearer now, its edges sharper. It wasn't behind the fence anymore. It stood on the same side as the girl, just a few steps back. I felt sick. The writing on the back had changed too. "You remember now." I didn't remember anything. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the girl and the shadow, both inching closer, both waiting for something. I kept the photo in a drawer, locked away, but it didn't matter. The dreams got worse. In one, the girl stood at the foot of my bed. Her eyes weren't blank anymore. They were full of something angry. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, just a low, guttural hum that made my teeth ache. The shadow was behind her, closer than ever. Its shape rippled, like it wasn't bound to the same rules as the rest of us. When I woke up, I didn't even check the photo. I grabbed the book, the photo, and a lighter, and took them to the alley behind my apartment. I doused them in lighter fluid and set them on fire. The flame caught quickly, consuming the old paper and ink. I stood there, watching the photo curl and blacken, feeling an odd mixture of relief and dread. But when the fire died, the photo was still there. Its edges were singed, its corners warped, but the image was intact. The girl stared up at me, her expression sharper now, her eyes burning with something that felt alive. The shadow was gone, and then I heard it, a faint knock at my apartment door, soft but deliberate. I turned, my chest tightening. The knock came again, louder this time. When I opened the door, no one was there. Just a single slip of paper, lying on the welcome mat. 3 words were scrawled across it in that same shaky handwriting. Do you remember? And behind me, from the shadows of my apartment, I heard the sound of something moving. Let's start a new story. It started about a month ago on my late-night drive home from work. I've always hated the stretch of highway between my office and my apartment. Long, empty, flanked by thick woods on either side. The kind of road where it feels like the darkness is pressing in from all sides, eager to swallow you whole. That night, the drive was quieter than usual. No other cars, no wind, just the soft hum of my tires against the pavement. I turned on the radio to fill the silence. Most stations were static this far out, but as I flipped through, one station came in clear. Crystal clear. The DJ's voice was soft, almost soothing. "Good evening, night travelers," he said. "You're listening to Station 103, The Quiet Hour, a place for those lost in the dark." I frowned. I'd driven this highway dozens of times and never heard of 103. The frequencies here were dominated by generic pop and country stations. Nothing this niche. Still, something about the DJ's voice drew me in. I left it on. The music was strange, low, atmospheric, like an orchestra tuning in slow motion. The kind of sound that made your skin prickle, even if you couldn't say why. Between songs, the DJ would speak in his calm, velvety tone, offering cryptic advice. Don't look too long at the trees. They'll look back. If you see headlights in your rear view, don't pull over. Just keep driving. At first, I thought it was some kind of experimental art broadcast. Weird, but harmless. Then the messages started getting personal. "We see you, James. 2 hands on the wheel now, buddy." I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. How'd he know my name? I stared at the radio, waiting for something, anything that could explain what I just heard. The DJ chuckled softly. "Easy now. You're not alone out there, are you?" I turned the radio off. The rest of the drive was tense, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant rustle carried on the wind. When I finally made it home, I told myself it was just a coincidence. A prank, maybe, someone hacking the airwaves. But the station wouldn't leave me alone. The next night it came on automatically. I hadn't touched the dial, but as soon as I started the car, there it was, 103, The Quiet Hour. "Welcome back, James," the DJ purred. "You're right on time." I shut it off again, my fingers shaking. Over the next week, the station grew more persistent. It turned itself on at random, sometimes in the middle of the day when I was parked at the grocery store. Sometimes the music would seep in softly, overlapping whatever station I was actually listening to, like a whisper threading through the air. And the messages kept coming. "You should get your brakes checked soon. Wouldn't want them to fail. That coffee shop you like? Maybe skip it today." Not all faces are friendly. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the predictions started coming true. My brakes did fail, barely a block from a mechanic shop. A man was arrested outside my favorite cafe after brandishing a knife at a customer. The station wasn't just talking to me. It was warning me. And then, last night, everything changed. It was close to midnight, and I was driving the same lonely stretch of highway, my headlights cutting through the dark. The station came on, unprompted, as it always did. "James," the DJ said, his voice lower now, more urgent. "There's someone in your back seat." I felt my blood turn to ice. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly it felt like my knuckles might snap. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror. There was nothing there. "Don't look," the DJ warned. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do I do?" I whispered. The DJ chuckled softly. "Keep driving, James. You're almost there. Almost where? The music shifted then, growing louder, more dissonant. The orchestral hum warped into something jagged and shrill, like a symphony collapsing in on itself. I could feel the air in the car change, heavier, colder. "Don't stop," the DJ said again, his voice cutting through the noise. "No matter what you see, no matter what you hear. Do not stop." That's when I saw the lights. Headlights in the distance, cresting the hill ahead. But something was wrong. They weren't moving. They were hovering, suspended midair like fireflies caught in a net. And then they blinked. Not headlights. Eyes. They were impossibly large, glowing yellow, and they turned toward me with slow, deliberate focus. The road in front of me began to twist, the yellow lines warping like snakes writhing under the asphalt. My car shuddered, the engine sputtering as if it were struggling against some unseen force. The DJ's voice cut through the chaos. "Almost there, James. Don't stop now." The eyes grew closer, the air around me vibrating with a low hum that rattled my bones. My ears were ringing, the world outside the car dissolving into swirling shadows and flickering light. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The road was quiet again, stretching out in front of me like nothing had happened. No eyes. No sados. The station crackled. "Good work, James," the DJ said, his voice soothing again. "You made it through. For now." I pulled into my driveway shaking, barely able to keep my hands steady enough to kill the engine. This morning, I woke up to find a note on my windshield. It wasn't handwritten. It was printed on crisp white paper, the font neat and clean. "Keep listening, James. You'll need us again soon." I don't drive much anymore, but the radio still comes on, and every time I hear the same voice, calm and familiar, waiting to guide me through whatever comes next. Because something is coming, and the station always knows. Let's start a new story. I had three: a pot hose by the window, a small cactus on the kitchen counter, and an overwatered fern I'd been trying to save for weeks. It was the cactus that tipped me off. I'd watered it the day before. Not that it needed it, but I'd been distracted, and there it was bone dry, like I hadn't touched it in months. I poked at the soil, frowning. Maybe I just imagined watering it. Things had been blurring together lately. Long days at work, late nights scrolling aimlessly, trying to ignore the gnawing loneliness of living alone. I shrugged it off and watered the cactus again. The next morning, I woke to find the cactus had been moved. Not far, just a few inches to the left, but I'd left it centered, hadn't I? Perfectly aligned with the corner of the counter. I convinced myself I was mistaken. Maybe I'd bumped it while cleaning. Maybe I was overthinking. But then it happened again. This time it was the pot hose. Its leaves, which had been trailing neatly down the side of the windowsill, were tangled, like someone had picked them up and let them drop in a heap. I stared at it, the watering can heavy in my hand. The plants weren't just being moved. They were being touched. Over the next week, the shifts grew more noticeable. The fern, always struggling, suddenly started sprouting fresh green shoots. The pothos leaves, once glossy, began to curl as though they'd been scorched. The cactus, my resilient little cactus, had bloomed, a tiny pink flower sitting at its crown. I'd owned it for 3 years. It had never bloomed before. "All right," I said aloud one evening, standing in the middle of my apartment with my hands on my hips. "This isn't funny." The room, of course, didn't answer. I checked the locks twice that night. The windows, the vents. No one was getting in. No one could be getting in. But the feeling remained. That creeping sensation, like someone had been in my space, moving through the apartment when I wasn't looking. The plants weren't the only thing that started changing. The photos on my fridge began rearranging themselves. I placed them carefully. A picture of me and my sister at a beach, a Polaroid of my parents on their anniversary, a postcard from a friend. One morning, I found them shuffled, the Polaroid at the bottom, the postcard crooked. Books on my shelves were pulled slightly out of place, their spines no longer flush with one another. The rug in my living room seemed to shift an inch to the left every night. I started staying awake later, trying to catch whoever or whatever was doing it. But the changes only happened when I wasn't looking. One night, I set up my phone to record. I positioned it carefully on the kitchen counter, its camera facing the pot hose by the window. I pressed record, then went to bed. The next morning, the cactus had moved again. I opened my phone with trembling fingers, scrubbing through the footage. For hours, nothing happened. Just the stillness of the room, the faint flicker of headlights passing outside. But then, just past 3 a.m., I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't human. Too thin, too angular. It flickered in and out of the frame, darting toward the pot hose with a speed that made my stomach churn. The leaves of the plant trembled. The shadow reached out, its arm elongating unnaturally. And then, just as quickly, it vanished. The video stopped. I stared at the screen, heart racing. I didn't recognize the thing I'd seen, but I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't me. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found a new change. There was a small pile of soil on the kitchen counter just beneath the cactus. Nestled in the dirt was a seed. It wasn't mine. I didn't touch it. I swept the dirt into the trash, threw the seed into the disposal, and turned it on, listening as the blade shredded it to nothing. But the next morning, the seed was back. This time it was on my bedside table. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach knotting. The lights in my apartment flickered faintly, and for a moment, the room felt wrong. Like I was standing in the same place, but in a slightly different version of it. That night, I dreamed of roots. They snaked through the walls of my apartment, coiling through the floors, wrapping around the pipes and beams. They pulsed faintly, like veins carrying blood, and from them sprouted flowers, bright and alien, their petals trembling with every beat of my heart. When I woke, my hands were covered in dirt. The plants weren't mine anymore. The pot hose had grown impossibly long, its tendrils curling around the window frame, crawling up the walls like they were reclaiming the space. The cactus had bloomed again, but the flower was different now. Larger, its petals glowing faintly in the dim light. The fern was unrecognizable, lush and vibrant, its fronds reaching toward the ceiling. And in the middle of the living room, where my coffee table had once been, was the seed. It had sprouted. I didn't water it. I didn't touch it. I packed a bag and left. I haven't been back since. But sometimes when I walk through the city, I see vines creeping up the sides of buildings, flowers blooming in places they shouldn't. And I know the apartment is still growing, waiting. Let's start a new story. The air in my apartment felt different, not cold exactly, but heavy like a storm about to break. The lights seemed dimmer than usual, even though every bulb was burning. It smelled faintly of ozone and something metallic, a smell I couldn't place but instinctively disliked. I didn't think much of it at first. The day had been long, my brain foggy from meetings and deadlines. I tossed my keys onto the counter and went to the bathroom to wash my face. That's when I saw it. My toothbrush was wet. It was such a small thing, hardly worth noting. But it stopped me in my tracks because I hadn't used it yet. I just walked in the door. I frowned, running my fingers along the bristles. They were damp, freshly used. For a second, I considered the possibility that I'd somehow forgotten brushing my teeth that morning. But I knew that wasn't right. I always brushed after breakfast, and the toothbrush had been dry when I left. I looked around the apartment, half expecting to find some sign of an intruder. But nothing was out of place. My windows were locked. The front door had been bolted when I came in. It didn't make sense. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd been distracted and simply forgotten. But the next morning, when I opened the fridge to grab my lunch, my leftovers were gone. I stared at the empty Tupperware container on the counter, lit off, bits of food clinging to the sides. I hadn't touched it since putting it away the night before. I felt my stomach drop. By the third day, it wasn't just objects moving or missing. The noises started. I was lying in bed when I heard it, a faint shuffle like footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the apartment above. It was closer. It was coming from the living room. Gripping my phone like a weapon, I crept out of bed, my breath shallow. The light from the street lamps outside spilled faintly through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. "Hello?" I called out. My voice cracked. The room was empty, but the couch cushions were slightly out of place, as if someone had been sitting there. I turned on every light in the apartment, refusing to sleep in the dark. Things escalated after that. Objects I didn't own started showing up. A pair of black leather gloves appeared on the kitchen counter one morning. They didn't belong to me. I didn't even recognize the brand. A book I'd never seen, an old, tattered novel with no title on the cover, sat neatly on my coffee table. One evening, I came home to find the shower running. Steam billowed out into the hallway. The mirror fogged up. I stood frozen in the doorway, listening to the water cascade into the tub. I turned it off with shaking hands, my reflection barely visible through the condensation. And there, on the fogged-up glass, were 3 words written in a jagged, uneven scrawl. "We are here." I didn't sleep that night. The dreams came next. In them, my apartment was always wrong, slightly warped like looking through a cracked lens. The walls leaned inward, the furniture stretched and distorted. In the corner of the living room, where the shadows pooled the deepest, something stood watching me. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but its shape was wrong, too tall and too thin, with limbs that twitched unnaturally. It didn't move closer, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the room cold despite the blankets. And then I heard it, breathing. It was soft, rhythmic, unmistakable, and it wasn't mine. The sound came from the far side of the bedroom, near the closet. I lay frozen, too terrified to turn and look. My eyes stayed locked on the wall, my body rigid as the breathing grew louder. I whispered, "Who's there?" The breathing stopped. That was worse. In the silence that followed, I felt the mattress shift, as if someone had sat down at the edge of the bed. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there was no one there. But the closet door was open, just a crack, and I swear I saw something move inside. The next day, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone why, didn't give notice to my landlord. I just drove, putting as much distance between me and the apartment as possible. For a while, things seemed normal. I rented a small room in a motel, kept the lights on, tried to forget. But it followed me. Last night, I woke up to find the gloves on the nightstand. The same black leather gloves I'd left behind in the apartment. And on the bathroom mirror, written in steam, was a single word. "Hello. It's not just my apartment. It's me. It's always been me. And now I know they'll never leave." Let's start a new story. I was helping my grandmother clean out her attic, sorting through decades of forgotten junk. Yellowed newspapers, broken lamps, boxes of Christmas decorations from the 70s. I was halfway through a stack of old photo albums when I found it. A single, loose photograph tucked between the pages. It wasn't like the others. The photos in the album were typical family snapshots. Picnics, birthdays, my dad as a kid grinning with missing teeth. But this one was different. The edges were frayed, and the image was slightly blurred, like it had been taken in a hurry. It showed a group of people standing in the woods, their faces indistinct, their clothes strange. The thing that caught my attention, though, was in the background. There was something behind the group, tall and dark, its outline jagged like shattered glass. It didn't look like it belonged in the photo at all. It wasn't a tree or a shadow. It was something else. "Who is this?" I asked, holding up the photo. My grandmother glanced at it, her face paling in an instant. "Where did you find that?" she snapped, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "In the album," I said. "Why? Who are these people?" She snatched the photo from my hand, her fingers trembling. "You shouldn't have found this," she whispered. "What do you mean?" She stared at the picture for a long time, then stood abruptly and stuffed it into her pocket. "Some things are better left alone," she said. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Who were those people? What was that thing in the background? My grandmother's reaction had been so intense, so unlike her, that I knew it wasn't just a random old photo. It meant something. The next day, I went back to the attic while she was out. I found the photo again, this time tucked under a pile of old newspapers. It had changed. The group of people in the photo was still there, but they were closer now, their blurred faces sharper, their features more distinct. And the thing in the background? It had moved. It was closer too, looming behind the group, its jagged outline sharper. The more I stared at it, the more it seemed to shift like it was alive. I shoved the photo into my pocket and left the attic, my skin crawling. That night, I dreamed of the woods. They weren't like the woods near my grandmother's house. Bright and open, filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. These woods were silent, the trees gnarled and black, their branches twisting like claws. I was standing on a narrow path, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. I felt something watching me, and when I turned around, I saw it. The thing from the photo. It was standing at the edge of the path, impossibly tall, its jagged form shifting like smoke. Its head tilted, and I heard a sound like glass cracking. When I woke up, my chest was tight, and the photo was on the nightstand beside my bed. I didn't put it there. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was just a bad dream. But the photo wouldn't let me. Every time I looked at it, it changed. The group of people moved closer with each glance, their faces more distinct, their expressions more hollow. The thing in the background grew sharper, its edges bleeding into the scene like it was part of it all along. By the third day, the photo didn't show the woods anymore. It showed my grandmother's house. I confronted her about it. "What is this?" I demanded, slamming the photo onto the kitchen table. "What's happening to it?" Her face went pale again, but this time she didn't look angry. She looked scared. "You've seen it now," she said, her voice trembling. "Seen what?" "The Watcher," she whispered. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, then sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's not a person," she said. "It's not even alive, not the way we are. It watches, waits, and follows. Once you've seen it," she trailed off, her eyes darting toward the window like she expected it to be there. "Once I've seen it, what?" She shook her head. "It doesn't stop." That night, the dreams got worse. I was back in the woods, but this time, the group of people was there too. They stood silently, their hollow eyes fixed on me. And behind them, the Watcher loomed. It stepped forward, the ground cracking beneath its weight, its jagged form cutting through the air like broken glass. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I woke up, the photo was lying on my chest. The woods were gone now. It was a picture of my room, and in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was the Watcher. I don't know what to do. The photo changes every time I look at it, and I can feel it getting closer. Last night I saw myself in the picture. I wasn't alone, and I think tonight it's going to step out. Let's start a new story. Morning. It wasn't the kind of thing I usually got. No address, no stamp, just my name scrawled across the front in looping black ink. The card itself was faded and old, the corners worn soft, but the image on the front was vivid. A desolate beach under a pale, overcast sky, the shoreline stretching endlessly into the distance. The words on the back were simple. "Wish you were here." There was no signature. At first, I thought it was a joke. I'd moved into the apartment 2 months ago, and while I didn't know many people in the area, it wasn't impossible that someone was playing a prank. Still, the postcard unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. I set it on the counter and tried to forget about it. That night, I dreamed about the beach. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and seaweed, the waves sluggish as they lapped at the shore. The sand was cold and damp under my bare feet, and the horizon stretched out in a pale, endless haze. I walked for what felt like hours, though I never saw another person. When I woke, I could still feel the grit of sand on my skin. The second postcard came 3 days later. This one showed a lighthouse perched on the edge of a jagged cliff, its paint peeling and weather-beaten. The sky behind it was a sickly shade of yellow-gray, the clouds hanging low and oppressive. The message on the back read, "It's waiting for you." I turned it over in my hands, a nervous knot tightening in my stomach. It looked like it had been written by the same person. Same looping handwriting, same old-fashioned ink. But there was no way anyone could have known about the dream. That night, the dream changed. I was on the beach again, the same endless stretch of damp sand, but this time the lighthouse was there, far in the distance. Its light swept across the horizon in lazy, mechanical arcs, though the bulb was dim and flickering. The waves were louder, too, crashing against the rocks with a force that sent a fine mist into the air. And this time, I wasn't alone. I saw it out of the corner of my eye first, something tall and thin moving just at the edge of the water. It was too far to make out clearly, but its shape was wrong, its limbs too long and angular. It didn't walk so much as glide, its head tilted in a way that made my chest tighten with a sick, instinctual fear. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, my sheets damp with sweat. The next morning, I checked the mailbox half expecting another postcard, but it was empty. I felt a mix of relief and unease, relief that it might finally be over, and unease that I wanted to know more. The third postcard didn't arrive until a week later. This one was different. The image on the front wasn't a beach or a lighthouse. It was my apartment. The view was unmistakable. The weathered brick facade, the ivy climbing the side of the building, the crooked fire escape. But the photo was wrong. It was too recent. The details matched exactly how it looked now, not how it might have appeared in old archives or photographs. The message on the back was just 2 words. Look closer. I dropped the postcard like it burned me. That night, I locked every window and double-checked the door, the bolt clicking into place with a satisfying weight. I didn't feel safe, though. I spent the evening sitting on the couch, staring at the postcard on the coffee table. Around midnight, the power went out. At first, I thought it was just the building. Our wiring wasn't exactly top-notch. But when I looked outside, the entire block was dark. The streetlights were out, the neighboring windows black. Even the sky seemed unnaturally heavy, the stars obscured by a low, oppressive fog. Then I saw the light. It was faint at first, a flickering glow just beyond the window. My heart raced as I moved closer, pressing my face to the glass. The lighthouse was there. It stood impossibly tall at the edge of the street, its crumbling exterior stark against the darkened buildings. The beam of its light swept methodically across the empty road, illuminating nothing but the mist that had begun to seep in. And standing beneath it, at the base of the tower, was the figure from my dream. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My phone was useless. No service, no signal. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. I could feel the pressure of something outside, pressing against the edges of my mind, filling the air with a tension so thick I could barely breathe. And then I heard it, a low, resonant hum, vibrating deep in my chest. It wasn't coming from the lighthouse or the figure outside. It was coming from the postcards. They were still on the coffee table, their edges curling slightly as if from heat. The hum grew louder, almost musical, and the room seemed to tilt and stretch, the walls warping like reflections on water. I couldn't move. The figure was at the window now. Its face, or what passed for a face, was pressed against the glass. Its pale surface devoid of features, except for 2 hollow impressions where eyes should have been. The hum shifted, deepened, and the glass began to crack. The last thing I remember is the sound of the window shattering, a sharp, crystalline crash that seemed to echo endlessly. I woke up on the beach. The sky was gray, the air thick with salt. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its light sweeping lazily over the empty shoreline. I was alone, my clothes damp and heavy, my skin cold. In my pocket, I found a single postcard. The image was of me, standing on the beach, staring at the lighthouse. The message on the back read, "Welcome home. Let's start a new story." The letters began arriving on a Monday. The first one was slipped under my door when I came home from work. The envelope was plain, unmarked, and sealed with no return address. At first, I thought it was junk mail, maybe a local realtor trying to get creative. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a single sheet of thick, off-white paper. Written in neat, looping handwriting was a message. "You forgot something." I stared at the words, my mind racing. There was no name, no explanation, no clue who had sent it. The handwriting didn't look familiar, and the paper smelled faintly of something floral, lavender maybe. I turned the envelope inside out, but there was nothing else. Just that single cryptic line. I told myself it was probably a prank. Kids in the neighborhood, maybe. But the next night, there was another letter. This time, the message was longer. "You left it behind. You shouldn't have. You need to come back." My hands trembled as I read it. The same neat handwriting, the same faint lavender scent. I checked the door, the windows, everything was locked. Whoever was leaving these letters wasn't just slipping them into my mailbox. They were getting inside. I called the building manager the next morning, demanding to know if anyone had been seen near my door. He assured me the cameras hadn't picked up anything unusual. Probably just some weird kid playing games, he said, shrugging it off. Don't let it bother you. I tried to believe him, but the third letter made that impossible. It arrived 2 days later, folded and tucked into the pocket of my coat. I hadn't worn the coat in weeks, and it had been hanging in the closet the entire time. My blood turned to ice when I pulled it out. You can't ignore it forever. It's waiting for you. That night, I started dreaming about the house. It wasn't a real house, not one I'd ever seen before. In the dream, it was always the same, a 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint, set in the middle of a vast, empty field. The sky above it was perpetually gray, the air heavy and oppressive. No matter where I stood, I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. The front door was always open, just a crack, and I always knew, deep down, that something inside was waiting. The fourth letter arrived the next morning. This time, the envelope contained a photograph. It was the house, the same one from my dreams, the same peeling paint, the same empty field. But there was something off about the photo. The windows were dark, but if I looked closely, I thought I could see a shape, a shadow, standing just behind the glass. On the back of the photo, scrawled in the same looping handwriting, was a single word. Remember. That was when I started to feel it, the pull. It was subtle at first, just a faint sense of unease whenever I tried to ignore the letters. But it grew stronger with each passing day. My dreams became more vivid, more insistent. The house was no longer just a passive presence. Now I could hear it, a low, rhythmic creaking like old wood groaning under pressure, a faint tapping sound as if something was knocking from the inside. And sometimes, when I got too close to the open door, a whisper. You need to come back. I didn't know what it meant. Come back where? I'd never been to that house. I was sure of it. And yet there was something about it, something buried deep in my memory, just out of reach. The fifth letter didn't come in an envelope. It was written directly on my bathroom mirror. The words were jagged, scratched into the glass with something sharp. It's time. I left that night, threw a bag together, and drove. No destination in mind, just the overwhelming need to get away. But the further I went, the more the pull grew. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a direction. I drove for hours, through towns I didn't recognize, past fields and forests that seemed to blur together. I didn't know where I was going until I saw it. The house. It looked exactly as it had in my dreams. Peeling paint, gray sky. The door cracked open just enough to see the darkness inside. The sight of it made my stomach lurch, but I couldn't stop. My feet carried me forward, up the creaking porch steps, and through the door. The air inside was thick, suffocating. Dust motes floated in the dim light, and the smell of lavender was overwhelming, almost nauseating. The interior was sparse, just a few pieces of ancient furniture draped in white sheets. The walls were bare except for a single photograph hanging in the hallway. It was me. I was standing in front of the house, younger, smiling, holding the hand of a woman I didn't recognize. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the image. The woman looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. And there, in the background, was the shadow, standing in the window watching. A faint sound broke the silence, the creaking of floorboards overhead. I don't know why I climbed the stairs. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around, to leave, to run. But the pull was stronger than ever, dragging me forward, step by step. The upstairs hallway was lined with doors, all closed except for one at the far end. Pale light spilled from the gap beneath it, flickering like candlelight. I pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a mirror leaning against the far wall. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, trembling. And then it moved. It stepped forward, out of the mirror. I don't remember much after that. Just the cold grip of its hand, the sound of its voice whispering in my ear. You left me here, but now you're home. I woke up in my car, parked in the middle of an empty field. The house was gone, but the letters keep coming. And every night, I dream of the mirror,